What if some of history's greatest discoveries were never supposed to exist? Beneath ancient cities, forgotten tombs, deserts, and layers of buried civilizations, archaeologists have uncovered objects and structures that challenge our understanding of the past. Some appear far more advanced than their supposed age, while others have no clear explanation for how or why they were created. From mysterious artifacts to lost civilizations and discoveries that seem completely out of place, each one reveals another gap in our knowledge of human history. Over the next 3 hours, we will explore some of the most impossible archaeological discoveries ever made, and examine the evidence, theories, and unanswered questions surrounding them. The Kalambo River tumbles 235 feet into a gorge on the border between Zambia and Tanzania, filling the air with a mist that never quite settles. Below the falls, the water slows into ancient floodplains, thick with mud and waterlogged sediment. It is not the kind of place where anything old should survive. Wood rots. Organic matter vanishes within decades, sometimes centuries, swallowed by insects, bacteria, and time itself. And yet, here, in the soft dark earth beside the river, archaeologists found 2 pieces of wood, deliberately cut, deliberately joined, and forgotten for what may be nearly 500,000 years. The discovery came in 2019, though its significance did not become clear until researchers from the University of Liverpool, led by Professor Larry Barham, applied a dating technique called luminescence dating, a method that measures when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight. The results, published in 2023, suggested an age of around 476,000 years. To put that in perspective, this predates Homo sapiens. Whoever shaped this wood was not us. Not exactly. The structure itself is modest in appearance. 2 logs, notched and fitted together at right angles, forming what looks unmistakably like the base of a platform or the beginning of a foundation. The notch is not accidental. It required forethought, a mental image of the finished object before the first cut was made. This is not a broken branch or a chance collision of driftwood. Someone shaped this with intention. That single fact unsettles the timeline we have long told ourselves about human origins. The conventional narrative holds that our early ancestors were nomadic, moving with the seasons, leaving behind only scattered stone tools. Portable, disposable, easily carried from camp to camp. Wood, by this account, was incidental. Spears, digging sticks, perhaps a fire-hardened point. Nothing permanent, nothing built to last. But a notched joint suggests something else entirely. It suggests construction. It suggests a structure meant to remain in place. Perhaps a raised platform above the seasonal floodwaters. Perhaps the framework of a dwelling. Perhaps something we don't yet have a name for. If early hominins, likely Homo erectus, or an as-yet unidentified contemporary species, were building at Kalambo Falls, then the story of when humans became settled, when we began to shape our environment rather than simply move through it, may need to be pushed back by hundreds of thousands of years. Mainstream archaeology treats the find cautiously. 2 logs are not a house. There is no roof, no walls, no clear floor plan, only a joint, preserved by a rare accident of geology, where the ever-saturated ground denied oxygen to the wood and slowed its decay to a crawl. Most researchers describe it simply as evidence of sophisticated carpentry, nothing more, nothing less. A skill, a capability, proof that intelligence with wood existed long before it was ever expected. But in the spaces where evidence runs thin, speculation tends to grow. Some ask whether other wooden structures once stood nearby, dissolved entirely by time, leaving Kalambo's joint as the sole survivor of an entire lost architecture. Others wonder how many similar sites might exist elsewhere in Africa, hidden beneath rivers and floodplains, never preserved, never found, simply gone. And a few more radical voices question whether our estimates of hominin cognition during this period are simply wrong, whether the line we've drawn between them and us is less a wall than a shifting fog. The wood at Kalambo Falls does not answer these questions. It only preserves the shape of an intention, a single decision made by unknown hands nearly 500,000 years ago. What were they building? And why, of everything they must have made, did only this survive, some 4,000 miles north of Kalambo Falls, and roughly 300,000 years further along the human story, the land changes character entirely. Africa's humid floodplains give way to the limestone plateaus of southwestern France, where the Aveyron River has spent millions of years carving through soft rock, hollowing out a labyrinth of caves beneath the countryside. One of these caves lies near the village of Bruniquel, its entrance narrow, unassuming, easy to miss. To reach what lies inside, a visitor must crawl, then climb, then descend again. Nearly 330 meters through absolute darkness, through passages so tight that daylight becomes a memory within the first few minutes. There are no natural light sources this deep. There never have been. Whatever happened here happened entirely by fire, entirely by intention, entirely without the sun. The cave was first explored in the 1990s by speleologists, and later studied more rigorously beginning in 1992 under François Rousseau, who noticed something that shouldn't have been there: burnt bone fragments and traces of fire, hundreds of meters from the entrance, in a zone no natural light or airflow could easily explain away as accidental. Rousseau died before the investigation could be completed, and for over a decade the site sat in a kind of scientific limbo, its full significance unconfirmed. It wasn't until 2016, when a team led by Jacques Joubert used uranium-thorium dating on the stalagmite formations at the site, that the true age of the structures became clear. The results were, by any measure, staggering. Approximately 176,000 years old. To understand why that number matters, consider what it means for who built this. Homo sapiens did not yet exist in Europe 176,000 years ago. Modern humans wouldn't arrive on the continent for well over 100,000 years more. The only hominins present in this region at the time were Neanderthals. Not modern humans, not their direct ancestors in any straightforward sense. Neanderthals, a species long characterized in the popular imagination as brutish, instinct-driven, incapable of abstract thought or symbolic behavior. And yet, deep inside this cave, something undeniably deliberate had been built. The structures themselves consist of hundreds of stalagmite fragments, broken from the cave floor and rearranged into two large, roughly circular formations, along with several smaller piles. The largest ring measures nearly 7 meters across, its broken stalagmite pieces stacked and arranged with what researchers describe as clear structural logic. Propped, layered, some pieces wedged to support others, forming walls of a sort, low but unmistakably intentional. Traces of fire were found throughout, scorch marks and burnt bone embedded directly into the structure, suggesting that flames were maintained here, inside the rings themselves, for some duration of time. This was not a place someone stumbled into and left. This was a place someone returned to, a place someone made. Consider what that required. The stalagmites had to be broken, by hand, likely using stone tools, snapped near their base in a process that itself would have taken considerable effort and time. They then had to be carried, arranged, and stacked with enough coordination that multiple pieces, from multiple individuals working together, formed a coherent shape rather than a random pile. And all of this happened in total darkness, illuminated only by fire that someone had to carry in, tend, and keep alive for as long as the work continued. How many hands did this take? How long did they stay? Was this the work of an evening, or a project returned to across years, perhaps generations? Mainstream archaeology reads the site cautiously but significantly. Most researchers agree that the Bruniquel rings represent the earliest known example of cave construction by any hominin species, and stand as strong evidence that Neanderthals possessed far more cognitive sophistication than they were once credited with. The capacity for planning, cooperation, and the controlled use of fire deep underground, away from any practical necessity like shelter from weather or predators. There was no reason to go this deep. No animal to hunt, no daylight to chase, no obvious survival advantage to venturing 300 meters into pitch darkness. Whatever drove them, it wasn't hunger, and it wasn't safety, which is precisely where the questions begin to multiply. Why go so far into the earth to build something? Ritual is the explanation offered most often. Some kind of ceremonial purpose, a gathering space, perhaps even something that could be called, cautiously, spiritual. But ritual is often the word scientists reach for when a purpose resists simpler explanation, and it raises as many questions as it answers. What belief system, what shared understanding, could motivate a group of Neanderthals to labor in absolute darkness, breaking stone, building walls no one outside their group would ever see? Others have wondered whether the ring served some more practical, if still mysterious, function. A boundary marker, a windbreak for a fire used in some process we can no longer identify, even a kind of territorial signature left deep in a place unlikely to be disturbed. And on the further edges of speculation, some have asked whether structures like this hint at a symbolic or cultural complexity among Neanderthals that has been systematically underestimated, whether the line between their minds and ours was ever as sharp as we assumed. Bruniquel does not resolve that question. It only makes it harder to dismiss. The fire that once burned inside those stone rings went out some 17,000 centuries ago. No one recorded why it was lit, and no one recorded why, eventually, it was allowed to die. The rings remain, patient and unchanged in the dark, exactly as they were left. What were they waiting for, down there, in a place the sun has never touched? And what does it mean that a species we once dismissed as simple was capable of finding its way to that answer, even if we, standing centuries later with all our tools and theories, still haven't found our way to it ourselves? Every discovery so far has asked the same quiet question in a different accent. Who was here? And were they capable of more than we assumed? At Kalambo, it was a joint cut into wood by hands that weren't quite human. At Bruniquel, it was a ring of broken stone, built by a species we once dismissed as incapable of abstraction. Now that question crosses an ocean, and an entire hemisphere once thought to be silent, empty of anyone at all, until a much later date than the story is about to suggest. In 1992, construction crews widening State Route 54 near San Diego, California, uncovered something unusual buried in the earth. The fragmented bones of a mastodon, an elephant-like creature that vanished from North America thousands of years ago. Paleontologists were called in, as they routinely are when construction disturbs old bone beds, and for a time the site was treated as a fairly ordinary paleontological find. Large bones, some scattered stones, nothing especially alarming. It sat that way in the record for over 2 decades. Then, beginning in 2014, a team led by Stephen Holen and Thomas Demarais took a second, closer look at what had been recovered, and the story the bones told became considerably stranger. The mastodon's limb bones showed signs of having been broken while still fresh. Spiral fractures, the kind that occur only when bone is struck with force while its collagen is still intact, not the brittle snapping that happens to bones long dead and dried. Nearby, several large stones showed wear patterns consistent with use as hammerstones and anvils, and scattered among the remains were what appeared to be flakes, small pieces of stone knocked loose in a pattern that, to the trained eye, looked less like geological accident and more like the signature of someone striking rock against rock, again and again with purpose. None of this, on its own, would have been extraordinary. Similar mastodon kill or scavenging sites have been documented elsewhere in North America. What made the Cerutti mastodon site different was its age. Using uranium-thorium dating on the bone material itself, the research team arrived at a figure that, when published in Nature in 2017, sent a visible tremor through the field of American archaeology, approximately 130,000 years. To understand why that number is so difficult to sit with, consider what the accepted timeline of human migration into the Americas actually says. For decades, the dominant model, known as Clovis first, held that humans arrived in North America no earlier than about 13,000 to 16,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska as the last ice age loosened its grip. Even the more recent, more generous revisions to that timeline, incorporating sites like Chile's Monteverde, rarely push human presence in the Americas back further than 20,000 to 25,000 years. The Cerutti site's claimed date isn't simply earlier than that. It is roughly 5 to 10 times earlier. It suggests someone, some hominin, was breaking mastodon bones with stone tools in California when Neanderthals were still building their stone rings in a cave half a world away, when Homo sapiens, by most estimates, had barely begun to spread beyond Africa at all. Which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question, if not Homo sapiens, then who? North America has no confirmed fossil record of Neanderthals, Homo erectus, or Denisovans. No skeletal remains of any pre-modern hominin have ever been found on the continent. The Cerutti researchers have been careful, almost deliberately restrained, in how they frame this. They do not claim to know which species did this. They present the bones and the stones and the dates, and they let the implication sit there, unresolved, because the evidence itself stops short of an answer. Unsurprisingly, the mainstream response was not universal acceptance. Many archaeologists have pushed back hard against the Cerutti findings, arguing that the fractures attributed to human activity could plausibly result from natural forces, the weight of sediment compacting over the bones, trampling by other large animals, geological processes acting on bone over vast stretches of time. The stones interpreted as tools, critics argue, may simply be rocks, unremarkable, unmodified, coincidentally positioned. This is, in essence, the same tension that runs through nearly every impossibly early archaeological claim. The line between deliberate human action and the slow, patient violence of geology is not always as clear as we would like it to be, and reasonable scientists can look at the same fractured bone and see entirely different stories. And yet the original research team has not backed down. They point to the specific pattern of the spiral fractures, difficult to replicate through sediment pressure alone. They point to the precise, repeated positioning of the hammerstones relative to the bone, a spatial relationship that geological accident struggles to explain as consistently as intention does. The debate remains, by most honest accounts, unresolved. Not dismissed, not confirmed, simply open. If the Cerutti team is right, the human story in the Americas would need to be rewritten almost entirely, stretched backward by well over 100,000 years, and populated by a species archaeology has not yet identified, using tools archaeology has not yet definitively named. If they are wrong, then this is simply a mastodon, dead long before anyone arrived to break its bones. Its fractures the work of nothing more than time and pressure and the slow settling of Earth. The bones remain in storage now, available for re-examination, waiting for whatever new dating method or forensic technique might someday settle the argument for good. But for now, they simply sit there in the dark of a California collections room, holding their spiral fractures and their silence, asking the same question this entire investigation keeps circling back to, from a cave in France to a gorge in Zambia to a highway median outside San Diego. How many times has someone been here before us, doing something we don't yet have the evidence or the imagination to fully explain? Imagine, for a moment, a single note. Low, breathy, imperfect, echoing off limestone walls in the dark. Now let that sound carry us across the world, from a California hillside back to Europe, to a cave in the Julian Alps of northwestern Slovenia, where the Adricha river valley climbs into forested limestone peaks. The cave is called Divje, Wild Women in Slovenian, named for old local folklore about spirits said to inhabit the mountain. Inside, sediment layers built up over hundreds of thousands of years, undisturbed, compressed, patiently recording everything that passed through. Ash from long-dead fires, the bones of cave bears who denned there each winter, and, in 1995, something small enough to nearly be overlooked entirely. The object is a fragment of a young cave bear's femur, roughly 11 centimeters long, pierced along one side by a neat row of holes. It was discovered by archaeologist Ivan Turk during a systematic excavation of the cave, found within a layer of sediment associated with Mousterian tools, the distinctive stone tool tradition attributed almost exclusively to Neanderthals. The surrounding layer was dated using a combination of methods, including radiocarbon and later analysis of the cave's stratigraphy, to somewhere between 43,000 and 82,000 years ago, with many researchers favoring a date in the range of 60,000 years. Once again, the timeline places this object in Neanderthal hands, in a Europe where Homo sapiens had not yet arrived in any significant number. At first glance, a punctured bone hardly seems like the kind of find that could divide a field of scientists for 3 decades. But look closer at those holes. 4 of them, roughly aligned, spaced at intervals that, if you were inclined toward music, might remind you of the finger holes on a woodwind instrument. This is precisely the claim that Ivan Turk and a small group of supporting researchers put forward, that this bone fragment is a flute, deliberately shaped by Neanderthal hands to produce musical notes, making it, if the interpretation holds, the oldest musical instrument ever discovered by a wide and almost uncomfortable margin, older than any confirmed bone flute made by Homo sapiens, older than cave painting, older by tens of thousands of years than almost anything else we associate with symbolic human culture. Consider what that would mean. Music is not survival. A flute cannot cut meat, cannot start a fire, cannot be thrown at a predator. If Neanderthals made this object for the purpose the holes suggest, they were doing something purely expressive, purely social, perhaps even purely emotional, shaping bone not to extend the body's reach into the physical world, but to create sound that meant something to whoever heard it. That is a very different picture of Neanderthal life than the one science held even a generation ago. It sits alongside what we now know from Bruniquel, another quiet suggestion that the boundary between their minds and ours may be thinner than we once insisted. But the flute interpretation has never gone unchallenged, and the counter-argument deserves its own careful hearing. A number of researchers, including a well-cited analysis led by Francesco De Rico, have argued that the holes in the Divje babe bone are not the product of deliberate carving at all, but the marks left by a cave hyena or another carnivore's teeth, puncturing the bone while gnawing on it for marrow. Cave hyena dens were common throughout this region during the period in question, and gnawed bones bearing puncture patterns are a well-documented, unremarkable feature of the fossil record. Under this reading, the object is not an instrument. It is simply a scavenged bone, marked by ordinary predation that happened to end up in a Neanderthal-associated layer through the slow churn of cave sediment. Where does that leave us? Somewhere, frustratingly, fascinatingly in between. Supporters of the flute hypothesis point to details that a hyena's teeth struggle to explain. The notable regularity in the spacing of the holes, and analyses suggesting the holes were created by a rotating, drilling motion, rather than the crushing bite of a carnivore. Skeptics counter that hyena bite patterns, while typically less regular, can under certain conditions produce configurations close enough to mimic intentional spacing, especially across a small sample size of one contested object. Neither side has produced the kind of conclusive, unambiguous evidence needed to end the argument outright, and the bone itself, housed today in Slovenia's National Museum, offers no further clues beyond what has already been extracted from it. What makes Divje Babe different from many of the other sites in this investigation is not the strength of the evidence, but the intimacy of the question it asks. This isn't a structure or a foundation or a tool used to break something apart. If the flute interpretation is correct, this is an artifact of feeling, evidence not of what Neanderthals could survive, but of what they might have loved or mourned or celebrated, in a moment of sound now 50 or 60,000 years silent. And if the skeptics are correct, then we are left with something almost equally strange. A species so frequently on the edge of being proven capable of art, of ritual, of symbol, that even an ordinary scavenged bone can plausibly be mistaken for the birth of music. The bone sits in its case in Slovenia now, 4 small holes in old, weathered ivory white femur, neither confirmed nor dismissed. Was it played once in the dark of that cave by lips and lungs unlike our own? Or is its melody something we invented afterward, hearing music in silence because we wanted, so badly, for someone that far back to have wanted to make it? Long before that bone flute was ever touched by lips or teeth in the caves of Slovenia, some 400,000 years earlier by some estimates, another chapter of this same story was already unfolding in what is now central Germany. To reach it, we don't travel far in distance, just a few hundred miles north and east, but we travel deep into time, back past the Neanderthals of Bruniquel and Divje Babe, back toward the very edge of what we're willing to call human at all. The site is Bilzingsleben, in the German state of Thuringia, an open-air location rather than a cave, a sloped basin that, hundreds of thousands of years ago, sat along the shore of a shallow, warm lake fed by mineral-rich springs. Those springs proved to be a stroke of extraordinary luck for archaeology, because the calcium carbonate they carried settled over the site's remains like a slow, mineral seal, encasing bones, tools, and traces of activity in travertine rock that preserved them with unusual clarity. Excavations here, led for decades by German archaeologist Dietrich Mania, beginning in the 1970s, uncovered one of the richest and strangest assemblages of the European Lower Paleolithic. Stone tools, animal bones by the thousands, traces of fire, and, at the center of ongoing debate, a series of deliberately arranged flat stones and bones, along with several pieces of bone-bearing sets of parallel, engraved lines. The dating places the site at roughly 350,000 to 400,000 years old, attributed not to Neanderthals, and certainly not to Homo sapiens, but to Homo erectus, or a closely related transitional hominin population, sometimes classified as Homo heidelbergensis. This is older than Bruniquel, older than the Kalambo wood joint by some estimates, depending on which end of that site's dating range you accept. We are, at Bilzingsleben, edging toward the very outer limit of what most textbooks describe as recognizably human behavior at all. Among the bones recovered from the site is a fragment of elephant tibia, its surface marked with a series of nearly parallel incised lines, arranged in a pattern too regular, some researchers argue, to be the accidental byproduct of butchery or trampling. Mania and his colleagues proposed that these engravings represented deliberate, non-utilitarian markings, made not to process the bone for food or material, but as a form of symbolic expression. If that interpretation holds, it would place intentional mark-making, a behavior closely tied to abstract thought and symbolic cognition, in the hands of a hominin species several 100,000 years before it is otherwise believed to have developed. Just as striking, though considerably more contested, is Mania's interpretation of the broader site. He described what he believed to be a deliberately leveled, paved area, roughly bordered by large stones, arranged bones, and post holes, which he suggested could represent the remains of a structure, or at minimum a purposefully organized living space, something approaching architecture, or at least the earliest suggestion of spatial planning, on a scale rarely proposed for this period. If accurate, this would place Homo erectus not merely surviving at Bilzingsleben, but organizing it, shaping the ground itself around some understanding of how space should be used. As with nearly every claim in this investigation, the response from the wider archaeological community has been considerably more cautious than the original proposal. Many researchers accept the engraved bone as genuinely intriguing, but stop short of endorsing it as unambiguous symbolic behavior, noting that similar parallel line patterns can, in some documented cases, result from stone tool marks made incidentally during butchery, particularly when a blade repeatedly scrapes along bone in a consistent motion. The difference between a mark made with symbolic intent and a mark made through repetitive practical action can be maddeningly difficult to distinguish once hundreds of thousands of years have passed, leaving only the line itself, silent about the mind that carved it. The proposed structure has faced even sharper scrutiny. Some archaeologists who have re-examined Mania's site reports and published critiques argue that the paved area and post holes may be better explained by natural site formation processes, the settling and shifting of lakeside sediment over immense stretches of time rather than deliberate construction. Without the ability to return to the original open excavation, now decades closed, later researchers are left working from records, photographs, and preserved samples, trying to judge intention from documentation instead of dirt. And yet Bilzingsleben has not been dismissed. It persists in the literature as a site worth arguing over precisely because dismissing it outright feels premature, and accepting it outright feels equally unearned. That tension is not unfamiliar by now. It is the same tension found in the fractures of a mastodon bone in California, in the punctured femur of a cave bear in Slovenia, in the notched wood at Kalambo Falls. Each time, the physical evidence stretches toward a conclusion that the accepted human timeline resists, and each time, the truth seems to live somewhere in the narrow, uncomfortable space between natural accident and deliberate act. The engraved elephant bone remains today in museum storage, its parallel lines exactly as they were left, sealed once by mineral water and now by scholarly disagreement. Were they cut by a hand, thinking in symbols, marking bone the way we might mark a wall or a page? Or were they the unintended signature of a task now lost to us, a butcher's motion repeated until it looked, to eyes 350,000 years removed, like something it never meant to be? The lake that once lapped at Bilzingsleben's shore is gone now, its water long since receded into the geological record. What else, we might wonder, settled quietly into that mineral seal, waiting for someone to notice the pattern in the stone? That engraved elephant bone, sealed for hundreds of thousands of years beneath mineral water, was not the last time bone would carry a message across the deep past. Some thousands of miles east, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, another fragment of bone would surface from the earth. Smaller, finer, and shaped with a precision that would ask an entirely different question about who, exactly, was capable of what and when. The location is Denisova Cave, tucked into the forested slopes above the Anhui River in southern Siberia, a place that has, over the past 2 decades, become one of the most significant archaeological sites on Earth. The cave takes its name from a hermit named Denis, who is said to have lived there in the 18th century, but its true significance lies far deeper in the sediment layers beneath the cave floor, layers that Russian archaeologists have been excavating in careful stages since the 1970s. It was here, in 2008, that researchers recovered a small bone fragment that would later yield a genome unlike anything previously catalogued, belonging not to a Neanderthal, not to a modern human, but to an entirely distinct, previously unknown branch of the human family tree. We now call them the Denisovans, and we know them almost entirely through genetics, because so little of their physical remains has ever been found. A finger bone, a few teeth, a fragment of skull. This cave is, for now, essentially the only place on Earth where their physical trace has been confirmed. But bones are not the only thing this cave has given up. In 2016, archaeologists recovered a small object from one of the cave's deeper layers. A bone needle, complete, with a fully formed eye drilled through one end, delicate enough to have threaded sinew or plant fiber for sewing fitted clothing. It was found in a layer associated, through dating, with an age of approximately 50,000 years, and, crucially, in a stratigraphic context linked not to modern humans, but to the same broad period and cave system where Denisovan and Neanderthal remains have both been recovered, in a region where the two populations are now known, through DNA evidence, to have interbred. Consider what a needle like this actually represents. This is not a crude awl for punching holes in hide. A drilled eye, fine enough to pass thread through, indicates fitted, tailored clothing. Not simply skins draped and tied for warmth, but garments cut and shaped to the body, sewn together with some degree of precision. That distinction matters enormously in an environment like Ice Age Siberia, where winter temperatures could fall well below freezing for months at a time. Loose hides trap some warmth. Fitted, sewn clothing traps considerably more, and represents a level of technological and cognitive sophistication, planning, fine motor control, and understanding of shape and structure that history has, until relatively recently, reserved almost exclusively for Homo sapiens. Here again, the question that has followed us through this entire investigation returns, reshaped. Was this needle made by modern humans passing through the region, or by the Denisovans and Neanderthals who are known to have inhabited these same cave layers during overlapping periods? The honest answer is that certainty remains elusive. Denisova Cave held all 3 populations at different, and in some cases likely overlapping, points in its long occupation history, and separating precisely who made and used which artifact within layers that mixed and settled over tens of thousands of years is an exceptionally difficult forensic task. Most mainstream researchers lean toward modern human authorship for the needle specifically, given its similarity to other Upper Paleolithic sewing tools found elsewhere. But the layers' dating and context have left the question open enough that some specialists continue to argue for the possibility of Denisovan or Neanderthal manufacture, a possibility that, if confirmed, would once again push technological sophistication further back and further outward than the standard narrative allows. What makes this needle different from the engraved bone at Bilzingsleben or the punctured femur at Divje Babe is that its purpose requires no interpretation, no debate over accidental marks versus deliberate ones. A needle with a drilled eye has exactly one function, and that function is unmistakably human in the broadest sense: the desire and the ability to shape material into something that serves a future need, to plan for a cold that hasn't arrived yet. Where the debate lingers is not over what the object is, but over whose hands closed around it 50,000 years ago, in a cave that has already rewritten our understanding of the human family tree once before. Denisova Cave continues to be excavated, layer by careful layer, and researchers openly acknowledge that its sediments likely hold more than they have yet given up. More bone fragments, more tools, perhaps more evidence that could finally settle which population sewed that first fitted garment in the Siberian cold. Until then, the needle sits in its case, its eyes still open, waiting for a thread that will never come. Whose fingers held it last? And how many other quiet technologies, born from populations we're still learning to name, are waiting in sediment layers we haven't reached yet, in caves we haven't found, for someone finally willing to ask who else might have been capable of this? By now, a pattern should be settling in, uncomfortable as it may be. Every site in this investigation has asked some version of the same question: who was here before we thought anyone could be? We have asked it of Africa, of France, of Germany, of Siberia. Now we ask it of a continent that, according to the version of history most of us were taught in school, should have had no one to ask about at all. The place is Serra da Capivara, a rugged expanse of sandstone canyons and scrubland in the northeastern Brazilian state of Piauí, a region so dry and remote that for most of human history it attracted little attention beyond the people who already knew it. Within this landscape sits Pedra Furada, a massive rock shelter formed beneath an overhanging sandstone cliff, its walls decorated with layers of ancient rock art. Red ochre paintings of animals, human figures, and hunting scenes. Some clearly quite old, others whose age would become the center of one of the most contentious debates in New World archaeology. Excavations at Pedra Furada began in earnest in the 1970s and 1980s, led by Brazilian-French archaeologist Suzanne Cécile Guidon, who directed extensive digging into the shelter's deep sediment layers. What her team found, layer after layer, were hearths, clearly defined areas of burned material and ash, alongside stone artifacts that Guidon and her colleagues interpreted as deliberately worked tools. Charcoal from the hearths was submitted for radiocarbon dating, and the results returned dates that seemed almost impossible to accept at face value. Some samples dated to over 48,000 years ago, with parts of the sequence suggesting human activity in South America stretching back that far and possibly further. To understand why this ignited such controversy, recall the same Clovis first framework mentioned earlier in this investigation. The idea that humans entered the Americas no earlier than roughly 13,000 to 16,000 years ago, crossing from Siberia into Alaska and spreading southward from there. A date of 48,000 years at Pedra Furada does not simply push that timeline back, it obliterates it. It would mean humans were present in South America tens of thousands of years before they were believed to have even entered the northern half of the continent, raising the question of how, and by what route, anyone could have arrived so early, so far south, when the conventional land bridge into Alaska wouldn't be viable for tens of thousands of years afterward. The stone tools recovered alongside the hearths only deepened the dispute. Guidon's team identified thousands of quartzite pieces they classified as deliberately flaked artifacts, bearing what they described as clear evidence of intentional shaping. If genuine, these would represent tool-making traditions in South America older than almost anything confirmed in North America, suggesting either an extraordinarily early migration by a population archaeology hasn't otherwise traced, or, more radically still, some form of independent toolmaking tradition that owed nothing to the standard out-of-Siberia migration story at all. Predictably, the scientific response was swift and deeply skeptical. A significant portion of the archaeological community, particularly in North America, argued that the tools from Perforated's deepest layers were not the tools at all, but geofacts, stones naturally fractured by rockfall from the sandstone cliff directly above the shelter, a process that can produce flake patterns superficially similar to deliberate human napping. The Hearths, critics suggested, might likewise have natural explanations, the product of wildfires or other non-human combustion rather than controlled fire building. This is, once again, the same fundamental tension that has run through this entire investigation. The maddening difficulty of distinguishing an object shaped by human hands from one shaped by the patient. Coincidental violence of geology, especially once tens of thousands of years separate the artifact from anyone who could simply explain it. Guidon and her supporters have pushed back firmly against these critiques, pointing to the sheer volume and stratified consistency of both the hearths and the tools across multiple excavation seasons, arguing that the pattern is too extensive and too repeated to attribute entirely to natural rockfall and wildfire. They have also noted that later excavations at other sites in the Americas, though rarely reaching Furada's most extreme dates, have gradually pushed the accepted timeline of human arrival earlier than the old Clovis model ever allowed, lending at least partial vindication to the broader argument that humans arrived in the Americas earlier, by a significant margin, than was assumed for most of the 20th century. Even so, Furada's oldest and most extreme dates remain a minority position within mainstream archaeology, neither fully disproven nor broadly accepted, sitting in an unusually persistent state of scientific limbo for a site that has now been studied for nearly half a century. It is worth pausing on that. Most contested sites eventually resolve one way or the other, as new dating techniques or fresh excavations tip the balance. Furada has resisted that resolution for decades, its hearths burning and going cold again and again in the sediment record, each layer offering a fragment of an answer that never quite completes the picture. The rock art still covers the walls above the shelter. Red figures of animals and hunters rendered by hands whose age we can only partially confirm. Somewhere beneath them, in ash that may or may not have been lit by human hands 50,000 years ago, the oldest chapter of the American story may already be written, waiting for someone to finally agree on how to read it. If it is true, who were these people, and why does the rest of the archaeological record of their journey remain so stubbornly silent? And if it isn't, why has this single shelter, more than almost any other site on Earth, refused to let the question go? From the red canyons of Piauí, we cross the Atlantic once more, back to the country that gave us Bruniquel's stone rings, though not quite to the same corner of it. Follow the Loire River westward through the Centre-Val de Loire region of France, past vineyards and limestone cliffs, until you reach the commune of Lingjing, where the river has carved into the rock a series of caves collectively known as La Roche-Cotard. The site was first excavated in the late 19th century and further explored across several campaigns throughout the 20th, yielding a substantial collection of Mousterian stone tools, again that toolmaking tradition closely associated with Neanderthals, embedded in sediment layers that would eventually be dated to around 57,000 years ago, placing the site firmly within a period when Neanderthals were the only hominins occupying this part of Europe, long before any confirmed presence of Homo sapiens in the region. But it wasn't the stone tools that would eventually draw the most sustained attention to La Roche-Cotard. It was the walls. Deep within one of the cave's chambers, researchers identified a series of marks pressed and carved into the soft cave wall. A set of non-figurative lines, some straight, some curved, some intersecting in patterns that, upon closer analysis published in 2023 by a team led by Jean-Claude Marquet, appeared to be neither random nor accidental. Using techniques including photogrammetry and 3D modeling, the researchers proposed that many of these marks were made by human fingers, deliberately pressed into the wall's soft, malleable surface, dragged and repeated in what they described as intentional, organized patterns, rather than the incidental scrapes of tool use or the claw marks of a cave-dwelling animal. The team went further still, dating the engravings themselves through the sediment sealing them, and arrived at a figure of approximately 57,000 years, once again placing the artist, if artist is the right word, squarely within Neanderthal hands. Consider what these marks would mean if the interpretation holds. This would not be a tool, it would not be a hearth or a hunting implement or even a needle sewn for warmth. These would be lines made for no purpose beyond the act of making them, dragged into a cave wall far from any daylight, seemingly for the sole purpose of leaving a trace, a pattern, a presence. If Bruniquel showed that Neanderthals could plan and build, and if Divje raised the possibility that they could make music, then La Roche-Cotard raises something even more difficult to dismiss casually: the possibility that they marked walls simply to mark them, the same impulse that, in Homo sapiens, we readily call art. The 2023 study's authors were notably careful in their language, avoiding the word art directly, and instead describing the marks as evidence of intentional, non-utilitarian mark-making, a term that allows for the behavior to be documented without forcing a judgment about what, if anything, it meant to the being who made it. This caution reflects a broader pattern in how the scientific community has learned, often through hard-won experience, to discuss Neanderthal symbolic behavior. Claims in this territory have a long history of being proposed, challenged, and sometimes ultimately vindicated only after decades of argument, and researchers working on sites like this one are acutely aware that their conclusions will be tested rigorously by colleagues predisposed to look first for a mundane explanation. And there have been mundane explanations offered. Some researchers have raised the possibility that certain of the marks could result from natural processes, the wall's soft tufa-like rock surface eroding unevenly, or being marked by the incidental contact of cave bears or other animals moving through the chamber over long stretches of time. But the specific configuration of many of the lines, their consistent depth and directional pattern, and the deliberate repeated finger-dragging technique proposed by the 2023 analysis have made this particular site more difficult to dismiss than many earlier, more ambiguous claims of Neanderthal symbolism. The debate here is less polarized than at Pedra Furada or the Cerutti site, if only because the marks themselves, unlike broken bone or scattered stone, seem almost to announce their own intention simply by existing in a place a hand had to be deliberately, awkwardly pressed. What remains unresolved, and may remain unresolved permanently, is the question underneath the question. Even if we accept that these lines were made on purpose, what did they mean to the one who made them? A mark pressed into a cave wall by a modern human might carry a story, a belief, a claim of territory, a memory of someone gone. We cannot ask a Neanderthal what these lines were for. We can only measure their depth, their spacing, their age, and stand in front of them the way, perhaps, someone once stood in front of that same wall 57,000 years ago, moved to leave something behind. The chamber at La Roche-Cotard remains sealed to casual visitors now, its walls protected, its lines carefully documented, but still, in the end, unexplained in the deepest sense. We know with reasonable confidence who pressed those fingers into the stone. We do not know why. And perhaps that is the quieter, more persistent mystery running beneath every discovery in this investigation so far. Not whether these ancient hands were capable of meaning, but whether we will ever find a way to recover what that meaning was. What did it mean? That question, left hanging over the finger marks at La Roche-Cotard, does not fade simply because we cross into a different chapter. It travels with us, south this time, far south, past the equator entirely, to a stretch of coastline where the Indian Ocean meets the southern tip of Africa. And here, the question finds an answer that is, for once, almost impossible to argue away. The site is Blombos Cave, perched above the shoreline near the town of Still Bay in South Africa's western cape, roofed by a modest overhang and facing a wide, wind-scoured view of the sea below. Excavations here, led since the mid-1990s by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood, have produced one of the most significant bodies of evidence for early symbolic behavior anywhere in the world, drawn from sediment layers dated to between roughly 75,000 and 100,000 years ago. Unlike so many of the sites explored so far in this investigation, the hands behind Blombos Cave are not in serious dispute. This is Homo sapiens territory, modern humans, working and living along this coast tens of thousands of years before their descendants would ever set foot in Europe or the Americas. What makes Blombos remarkable is not a single artifact, but an accumulation of them, each one deepening the same conclusion. In 2008, Henshelwood's team uncovered a toolkit unlike anything previously documented from this period. 2 abalone shells containing a mixture of ground ochre, crushed charcoal, crushed bone, and what appeared to be a binding liquid, alongside the grinding stones and stirring implements used to combine them. This was not a tool for cutting or hunting. This was a workshop, in the most literal sense, for producing pigment. Someone, roughly 100,000 years ago, sat at this spot on the South African coast and mixed a paint. The implications of that single act ripple outward considerably further than they might first appear. Producing ochre pigment in this way requires a sequence of planned steps, carried out in a specific order, with an understanding of how each ingredient would behave and combine, and it requires containers to hold the mixture until it was ready to use, and presumably some purpose in mind for the paint once it was made, whether for body decoration, marking objects, or some ritual application now lost entirely to time. This is chemistry in essence, applied with intention toward an outcome that has nothing to do with immediate survival. And crucially, unlike so many of the ambiguous marks and fractures examined elsewhere in this investigation, there is little serious debate over whether this was deliberate. The shells, the grinding stones, the mixed pigment residue, recovered together in clear context, leave very little room for a natural, accidental explanation. Alongside the ochre workshop, Blombos has yielded other objects that reinforce the same picture. Pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate, cross-hatched geometric patterns have been recovered from layers dated to around 73,000 years ago, their lines carved with clear intention into the soft stone, forming designs that bear no obvious practical function beyond their own visual pattern. And in a discovery announced in 2004, the site produced dozens of small, perforated nacreous shells, pierced through in a location consistent with deliberate stringing rather than natural wear, dated to roughly 75,000 years ago. Wear patterns on the shells suggested they had been strung and worn, rubbing against each other and against fabric or skin over time, in what most researchers interpret as some of the earliest confirmed personal ornamentation, jewelry, in the archaeological record. Taken together, these objects paint a picture, quite literally, of a population engaged in behavior that checks nearly every box associated with symbolic modern cognition: pigment production and use, geometric design, personal adornment worn and displayed to others, For decades, the emergence of this kind of behavioral modernity was assumed to have occurred far later, and largely in Europe, tied to the dramatic cave paintings and carved figurines of sites like Lascaux and Chauvet, some 30,000 to 40,000 years old. Blombos pushes that emergence back by tens of thousands of years and relocates its origin to Africa, reframing the story not as a sudden late flowering of human creativity in a single region, but as a slow, geographically dispersed development, stretching across a much longer, much older timeline. Where does mystery remain in a site this well documented? Largely in the question that has followed every artifact in this investigation, even here, even with evidence this clear. What did any of it mean to the people who made it? We can confirm that ochre was mixed, that shells were pierced and strung, that geometric patterns were carved with purpose. We cannot recover the story attached to any of it, the belief or custom or relationship that gave a strand of shell beads its significance to the person who wore it, or told the ochre mixer what color and for what occasion the pigment needed to be. The technology of meaning-making is here, laid out with unusual clarity. The meaning itself is not, and perhaps never will be. The cave still looks out over that same stretch of ocean today, wind moving across water that has watched this shoreline for longer than most landscapes on Earth have watched anything at all. Somewhere in that view, a person once sat with a shell full of red pigment, working towards some purpose we can describe in every physical detail except the one that mattered most to them. What color did they choose in the end, and who or what was it for? That carved ochre from Blombos Cave, its cross-hatched lines cut with obvious care into stone, was not the last time this investigation would encounter deliberate geometry etched into rock. Carry that image forward now, across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, to a much colder landscape, where geometry appears again, this time in 3 dimensions, carved into small stone spheres that continue to defy easy explanation. Across the northeast of Scotland, particularly concentrated in Aberdeenshire and the surrounding regions, but found scattered as far as Ireland and parts of northern England, archaeologists have recovered several hundred carved stone balls, most of them roughly the size of a cricket ball, small enough to sit comfortably in the palm of one hand. They date, by most estimates, to the late Neolithic period, roughly 3200 to 2500 BC, placing them in the same general era as the construction of Skara Brae and the earlier phases of monuments like Stonehenge. Made primarily from sandstone, granite, and other locally available stone, these objects are remarkable not for their size, but for what covers their surface. Carefully carved raised knobs, arranged with striking geometric regularity, ranging from simple spherical arrangements of 6 evenly spaced protrusions to considerably more elaborate examples bearing intricate spiral and geometric patterns that some researchers have compared, cautiously, to principles later associated with Platonic solids, symmetrical 3-dimensional forms formally described in Greek mathematics more than 2,000 years after these stones were carved. That comparison alone is enough to explain why these objects have generated such sustained fascination, both within and outside mainstream archaeology. A small stone ball carved with 6 knobs is one thing, but several of the more complex specimens display symmetrical arrangements corresponding closely to the geometry of a cube, an octahedron, even more elaborate polyhedral forms carved by hand using stone tools by a Neolithic population with no written mathematical tradition that we know of. How does a carver, working without any of the formal geometric language that would eventually be developed by Pythagoras or Plato, arrive at proportions this precise, this consistent, across hundreds of separate objects found scattered across a wide geographic area? The honest, mainstream answer is that we don't fully know, and that uncertainty extends well beyond the mathematics of the carving to something more basic. We don't actually know what these objects were for. Unlike the ochre workshop at Blombos, where the function, if not the meaning, was reasonably legible from the physical evidence, the grooved spheres of Scotland have resisted confident functional interpretation for well over a century of study. Multiple theories have been proposed, and none has achieved anything close to consensus. Some archaeologists have suggested the spheres served as weapons, perhaps attached to a cord or handle and used as a mace head or thrown projectile, their weight and shape suited to blunt impact. Others have proposed a more mundane, domestic explanation. Tools for grinding grain or processing hides, their knobbed surface useful for gripping or applying pressure. Still, others have suggested they functioned as measuring devices, standardized units of weight or volume used in trade or construction. Their consistent size across finds hinting at some shared, agreed-upon standard. And a significant number of researchers have leaned toward the ceremonial, proposing that these were objects of status or ritual significance, perhaps markers of authority passed among community leaders or items used in rites we no longer have any record of, their careful, painstaking craftsmanship suggesting value well beyond simple utility. Each of these explanations runs into the same basic obstacle. The physical evidence doesn't clearly favor one over the others. The stones show little to no wear consistent with heavy use as weapons or tools, no consistent residue suggesting grinding or grain processing, and no accompanying written or pictorial record, of course, to confirm any ceremonial role. They have been found in a range of contexts, some near settlements, some in what appear to be burial or ritual sites, some seemingly isolated, offering no single, clean pattern that would settle the debate. In a sense, the spheres occupy a position unlike almost anything else examined in this investigation so far. We are not arguing here, as we were with the Cerutti mastodon bones or the Bilzingsleben markings, over whether these objects were made deliberately. That much is beyond serious dispute. The carving is too precise, too repeated across hundreds of examples to be accidental. The mystery here is not who, or even really when. It is simply why. That open question has, predictably, drawn speculation from beyond the boundaries of mainstream archaeology. Some observers, noting the apparent correspondence between certain spheres and the symmetry of Platonic solids, have wondered whether Neolithic Scotland possessed a far more sophisticated informal understanding of three-dimensional geometry than we typically credit to a non-literate society, an intuitive, hands-on mathematics developed and passed down without ever being written or formalized. Others, further out on the spectrum of interpretation, have proposed that the spheres may represent something closer to astronomical or cosmological models, physical representations of ideas about the shape of the world or the arrangement of the heavens, comparisons occasionally drawn, however loosely, to the region's other Neolithic monuments with clear alignments to solstices and lunar cycles. Mainstream archaeology treats these interpretations with considerable skepticism, generally preferring more modest explanations rooted in ritual or status. But the fact remains that no explanation, modest or otherwise, has managed to fully account for the geometric precision on display. What makes the grooved spheres particularly haunting, in the context of everything else this investigation has traced, is their sheer number. This is not a single anomalous find, easy to dismiss as a fluke or an outlier. Several hundred of these objects have been recovered, spread across a wide region, spanning centuries of late Neolithic life. Whatever purpose they served, it was not a passing curiosity practiced by one isolated community. It was, it seems, a sustained tradition, understood and repeated widely enough to leave this many traces behind, and yet somehow narrow enough or private enough that it left no written record, no clear iconography, nothing beyond the stones themselves to explain what they meant to the people who so carefully shaped them. Most of the surviving spheres now rest in museum collections across Scotland, catalogued, measured, photographed from every angle, their geometry documented with a precision the original carvers, ironically, may never have had the mathematical language to fully articulate themselves. And still, after more than a century of study, the central question remains essentially untouched. What were they for? Was the answer something as ordinary as trade, weighed and measured against a standard we've simply lost the key to reading? Or does the astonishing precision carved into these small stones point towards something we haven't yet found the right question to ask about the minds that made them? The carvers of those Scottish spheres left behind precision, but no names, no faces, nothing to attach to the hands that shaped them. Long before any of that geometry was cut into stone, though, another set of hands, working in an open floodplain in what is now central Germany, was solving a different kind of problem entirely. Not how to represent a shape, but how to bring down something fast enough to outrun you. The site is Schöningen, situated beside an open-cast coal mine in Lower Saxony, a location that owes its extraordinary preservation to the same kind of lucky accident found at several other sites in this investigation. Roughly 300,000 years ago, the area was the marshy shoreline of an ancient lake, and when the objects buried there were finally excavated, beginning in earnest in the 1990s, the waterlogged, oxygen-poor sediment had done exactly what it did at Kalambo Falls. It had held wood in near-perfect suspension, protecting it from the decay that erases almost everything organic from the archaeological record within a few centuries, let alone a few hundred millennia. What emerged from that mud was a collection of wooden hunting equipment, unlike anything previously known from this period. Most famous among the finds are several complete wooden spears, roughly 6 to 7 feet long, carved from spruce and pine, their shafts tapered and balanced with a sophistication that startled the researchers who first examined them. Weight distribution consistent with weapons designed to be thrown accurately over distance, not merely thrust at close range. These spears, dated to approximately 300,000 years old, are widely regarded as some of the oldest known hunting weapons in the world, and their existence alone forced a significant reconsideration of the capabilities of the hominins who made them, generally identified as Homo heidelbergensis, a species positioned somewhere between Homo erectus and the later emergence of Neanderthals and modern humans. But alongside the spears, excavators recovered something smaller, and in some ways more quietly puzzling. A set of shorter wooden implements, roughly 2 feet in length, carved and shaped with a curvature that researchers have compared to a boomerang or throwing stick. Analysis published by a team including Nicholas Connard suggested these objects were aerodynamically shaped, their weight and curve consistent with tools designed for rotational flight through the air, likely used to hunt smaller, fast-moving game such as birds or hares, animals that would be difficult to bring down with a heavier thrusting or throwing spear. Consider what this second category of tool implies, sitting alongside the spears that share its sediment layer. This is not simply a population capable of building a single, effective weapon and repeating it. This is a population that had apparently developed a differentiated toolkit, matching different weapon designs to different kinds of prey, understanding that a large herbivore and a fast-moving hare required entirely different solutions, and engineering wood accordingly for each. That kind of specialization suggests not just physical skill, but a working knowledge of aerodynamics, refined, whether consciously theorized or simply learned through generations of trial and adjustment, into a set of tools that functioned as intended. Wind tunnel testing conducted on replicas of the Schöningen throwing sticks in later research reportedly confirmed that their shape produced stable, effective flight, lending physical support to the idea that their curved form was no accident of carving, but a deliberate aerodynamic solution. The wider site adds further texture to this picture. Alongside the wooden weapons, excavators uncovered the butchered remains of dozens of horses, evidence interpreted by many researchers as the debris of coordinated, large-scale hunting events, in which groups of hominins worked together to drive and kill animals along the lake's marshy shoreline, then process the carcasses on site. If that interpretation holds, Schöningen represents not an isolated hunting incident, but a location returned to repeatedly, perhaps seasonally, by a population organized enough to plan cooperative hunts, distribute labor, and process substantial amounts of meat in a coordinated fashion. This is social behavior of a complexity that 300,000 years ago is not typically what the standard narrative assigns to Homo heidelbergensis. As with so many of the sites in this investigation, the mainstream interpretation of Schöningen is generally cautious but genuinely impressed, treating the spears and throwing sticks as strong evidence of advanced cognitive and technical capability considerably earlier than long assumed, while stopping short of more speculative claims about the social or symbolic life of the hominins who made them. Some researchers have pushed the implications further, however, suggesting that a toolkit this refined implies not just physical skill passed hand to hand, but some form of teaching, some structured way of passing complex, multi-step manufacturing knowledge from one individual to another, across what would have needed to be multiple generations for a technology this consistent to persist across the archaeological layers found at the site. There is also, inevitably, an undercurrent of more speculative thinking that has attached itself to Schöningen, as it has to nearly every site in this investigation where the technology on display seems to outpace the assumed intelligence of its makers. Some have asked whether aerodynamic engineering this precise implies a longer, deeper history of tool experimentation than the archaeological record has preserved, a hidden lineage of trial, failure, and refinement stretching back further than any site yet discovered, its earliest chapters lost entirely to time and decay. It is a difficult question to answer, if only because would this old surviving at all is such a rare event that we have little basis for comparison. How much of this technological story is simply missing, dissolved silently into soil that never happened to seal it away the way Schöningen's ancient lakebed did? The spears and throwing sticks now rest in careful climate-controlled storage, wood that has outlasted the species that carved it by a margin difficult to fully comprehend. They were built for a single, practical purpose: to fly true, to strike, to bring something down before it could escape into the trees or across the water. And yet, 300,000 years later, they raise a question with nothing to do with hunting at all. If a species we still debate the intelligence of could engineer flight this precisely into a piece of wood, what else, carved from material too fragile to survive, might have flown from their hands and simply never made it down to us, 10,000 miles from that German lakebed, and roughly 290,000 years after those throwing sticks were last thrown? A different kind of hunting tool was beginning to accumulate in a high-altitude cave in north-central Mexico, one that would eventually reopen an argument this investigation has already circled twice before. How old, really, is the human story in the Americas? The site is Chiquihuite Cave, tucked nearly 3,000 meters above sea level in the Astillero Mountains of Zacatecas, a remote, high-altitude location that makes the very idea of ancient human occupation seem, at first glance, almost implausible. This isn't a gentle coastal shelter or a river-carved passage at modest elevation. It's a cold, thin-aired cavern reached only after a demanding climb. The kind of place that raises an immediate question before a single artifact is even considered. Why would anyone, particularly anyone crossing into an unfamiliar continent for the first time, choose to shelter here? Excavations at Chiquihuite, led by archaeologist Cyprian Ardelean and an international team, began in earnest in the 2010s and culminated in a set of findings published in Nature in 2020 that immediately placed the site at the center of the same debate that has followed Pedra Furada for decades. Ardelean's team recovered nearly 2,000 stone artifacts from the cave's deep sediment layers, which they interpreted as deliberately produced tools alongside organic material used to establish a chronology through radiocarbon dating. The results suggested human presence at the site stretching back as far as 26,500 years, with some interpretations of the deepest layers hinting at activity extending even earlier, potentially past 30,000 years. To place that figure alongside what we've already covered, this predates the traditional Clovis-era arrival of humans in North America by well over 10,000 years, and lands closer to, though still considerably more conservative than, the extreme dates proposed at Pedra Furada in Brazil. Unlike Pedra Furada's most controversial layers, however, Chiquihuite's proposed dates fall within a range that a growing number of archaeologists now consider at least plausible, part of a broader, slow-building shift in the field toward accepting a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas, evidenced by a handful of other sites, including Monteverde in Chile and White Sands in New Mexico, that have each, in their own way, chipped away at the old 13,000 to 16,000 year ceiling. Still, Chiquihuite's claims have not been accepted without serious resistance, and the nature of that resistance is worth sitting with, because it illustrates something particular about this kind of archaeology. The stone objects recovered from the cave are, for the most part, made of limestone, the same material that forms the cave's own walls and ceiling. Critics, including several prominent archaeologists who reviewed the 2020 publication, have argued that what Ardelean's team identified as deliberately flaked tools may in fact be geofacts. Once again, pieces of limestone fractured naturally by rockfall, freeze-thaw cycles, or other geological processes common in a cave environment, built from the very stone the tools are made of. This is, in some ways, an even harder problem than the geofact debates surrounding Pedra Furada or Cerutti, because at those sites the stone in question was at least brought in from elsewhere, or associated with bone that could independently confirm human activity. At Chiquihuite, the argument centers on whether the cave itself might be quietly manufacturing its own false archaeology, one accidental fracture at a time. Ardelean and his colleagues have pushed back against this critique with a combination of statistical and technical arguments, pointing to the specific flake patterns, edge damage, and repeated forms found among the assemblage, arguing that the consistency and repetition across nearly 2,000 pieces is difficult to attribute to random geological fracturing alone. They have also noted that the artifacts were recovered in stratified layers alongside other supporting evidence, including ancient environmental DNA extracted from the sediment itself, which in a related 2020 study suggested the presence of a range of plant and animal species consistent with a changing ecosystem over tens of thousands of years, lending broader context to the site's long occupation history, even if it cannot, on its own, confirm who exactly was present in its earliest layers. Where does that leave Chiquihuite, several years on from its initial publication? Roughly where Pedra Furada has sat for decades, and where the Cerutti Mastodon site continues to sit as well. Acknowledged, debated, neither dismissed outright nor broadly accepted as settled fact. Some researchers view it as important corroborating evidence for a genuinely older human presence in the Americas, part of a slowly emerging consensus that the continent's peopling was earlier and more complex than the old single migration model allowed. Others remain convinced that the site's deepest, most controversial layers reflect the patient work of geology rather than human hands, and that the true date of first arrival still lies somewhere closer to the more conservative end of the pre-Clovis window. What makes Chiquihuite worth sitting with, at this point in the investigation, is how familiar its central tension has become. Once again, we are asked to distinguish intention from accident using nothing but the shape of stone, worn down by forces that don't announce themselves, in a location high and remote enough that any answer feels, on some level, improbable, regardless of which side of the debate proves correct. Why climb nearly 3,000 meters into thin, cold air to shelter in a cave, unless something about that height, that isolation, mattered enough to justify the climb? The cave remains under study, its sediment still being sifted, its dates still being cross-checked against new techniques as they become available. Somewhere in those deep, cold layers, either the record of a long, mostly hidden chapter of the human story in the Americas is quietly preserved, waiting for enough consensus to finally accept it, or a mountain has simply been breaking its own stone for tens of thousands of years, patiently assembling something that only looks, to hopeful eyes, like the work of hands. Which version of that story is written into the limestone, and how much longer will it take before we're able to read it with any real certainty? Picture heat. Not the dry heat of a Zacateca's cave mouth, but something closer and more controlled. A small fire tended carefully within a rock shelter, its flames kept low and steady, someone's attention fixed not on cooking, not on warmth, but on a small pot of dark, viscous liquid held just above the coals. Watch the way a chemist watches a reaction they cannot afford to get wrong. That shelter is Sibudu Cave, perched on a sandstone cliff above the Uthongati River in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. A site that has, over more than 2 decades of careful excavation, led primarily by archaeologist Lynn Wadley, produced one of the richest and most technologically startling records of early human innovation found anywhere on the continent. Sibudu's occupation layers span an enormous stretch of time, but it is the deposits dated to between roughly 70,000 and 40,000 years ago that have drawn the most sustained scientific attention, because buried within them is evidence of something that, on the surface, sounds almost too advanced to belong there at all. Compound adhesive technology, deliberately engineered glue. The evidence takes the form of stone tool points recovered with traces of hardened residue still clinging to their base, the leftover glue once used to haft them, to fix a small stone blade securely into a wooden shaft or handle. Analysis of that residue, conducted by Wadley's team and published across several studies beginning in the mid-2000s, revealed something far more sophisticated than a simple daub of tree sap pressed on and left to dry. The adhesive was a compound mixture, combining plant gum, typically extracted from acacia trees, with red ochre, the same iron-rich pigment encountered earlier in this investigation at Blombos Cave, mixed in at a specific, seemingly deliberate ratio. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Plant gum alone, when it dries, tends to become brittle, cracking under stress and failing exactly when a hafted tool needs to hold firm, during the shock of impact against an animal or another hard surface. Ochre, when added in the right proportion, changes the physical properties of the mixture, reducing brittleness and increasing the compound's resistance to moisture and humidity, effectively transforming an ordinary tree resin into a durable, functional adhesive suited to the demands of real use. Producing this glue was not a matter of chance. It required understanding, refined, presumably through trial, observation and repetition, that 2 specific ingredients combined in a specific way produced a material property that neither ingredient possessed on its own. Consider what else this process demanded. The gum needed to be heated carefully at a controlled temperature, hot enough to become workable, but not so hot that it degraded or burned. Too much heat destroys the very quality that makes the compound useful. This means whoever produced this adhesive at Sibudu cave, tens of thousands of years ago, was not simply gathering and combining materials. They were managing a chemical process with a narrow window of success, monitoring temperature without a thermometer, judging readiness by sight, smell, or texture, refining a recipe through repeated attempts until it consistently worked. Some researchers describe this as evidence of what they term multitasking cognition, the kind of layered, sequential planning and abstract, forward-looking thought that requires holding several variables in mind simultaneously, working toward an outcome that exists only as a mental image until the process is complete. The population responsible for this technology at Sibudu was, unlike so many of the more contested hominins explored earlier in this investigation, Homo sapiens, placing the compound adhesive discovery within the broader, expanding picture of early modern human sophistication in Africa, alongside the ochre workshop and engraved patterns of Blombos cave, situated along roughly the same coastline, separated by both distance and time, yet telling a strikingly similar story. Together, these southern African sites have become central to a broader argument reshaping how the origins of modern human behavior are understood, not as a sudden explosion of creativity that occurred once modern humans reached Europe, but as a long, cumulative, and geographically dispersed process, unfolding gradually across Africa over tens of thousands of years, largely invisible to us until sites like Sibudu began, slowly, to surface its evidence. And yet, even here, in a case where the makers are confidently identified and the chemistry has been reconstructed with real precision, a version of the same open question that has followed this entire investigation persists. How was this knowledge held and passed on? There is no writing at Sibudu, no diagram, no recipe recorded for others to follow. Whatever method existed for teaching this compound's exact ratio, its correct heating temperature, its proper handling, had to travel entirely through direct demonstration, spoken instruction, or careful imitation, transmitted from one person to another, and from one generation to the next, across a span of time long enough that the technology appears, reliably again and again throughout Sibudu's occupation layers. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It suggests something we rarely get to see directly in the deep archaeological record. A structured tradition of teaching, patient and deliberate, passed down the way any valuable technical skill must be, through people who cared enough about getting it right to make sure the next generation could too. Some researchers examining Sibudu's broader toolkit have gone further still, proposing that this level of chemical and procedural sophistication implies cognitive capabilities fully equivalent to those of modern humans today, undermining any lingering assumption that early Homo sapiens in Africa were, in some meaningful sense, less mentally developed than the populations who would later populate Europe and produce its famous cave art. If a population 70,000 years ago could reliably engineer a compound adhesive with a precise, repeatable formula, the argument goes, there is little reason to believe their minds worked any differently than ours do now, separated from us by time, not by capability. The residue on those ancient stone points has long since gone cold, its fire extinguished tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to wonder who tended it. But somewhere in that careful, controlled process of watching, waiting, judging heat by instinct and mixing by memory, a very old, very human question quietly persists. How many other solutions, refined patiently over lifetimes and passed hand to hand in silence, have simply left no residue at all for us to ever find. From the sandstone cliffs of KwaZulu-Natal, we travel now to a landscape almost impossibly different. The gypsum dune fields of White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, a place where the ground itself is made of pale, wind-sculpted crystal, blinding white beneath a desert sun. But beneath the shifting surface dunes lies something older and stiller, the remnants of ancient Lake Otero, a Pleistocene-era lake that once covered this basin, its shoreline mud recording, layer by patient layer, the passage of everyone and everything that walked across it. What makes White Sands extraordinary is not a tool, not a bone, not a deliberately shaped object at all, but something far more immediate and, in its own way, more intimate. Footprints, thousands of them preserved in ancient lakebed sediment and identified across a series of excavations led by the U.S. Geological Survey and the National Park Service, with major findings published in a landmark 2021 study led by Matthew Bennett and colleagues in the journal Science. The tracks include not only human footprints but the impressions of Ice Age megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, and dire wolves, layered together in ways that occasionally suggest direct, immediate interaction. Human tracks crossing paths with sloth trackways, at one point appearing to show evasive movement, as if a person had briefly altered course to avoid, or perhaps to approach, an enormous animal close enough to see clearly in the moment the print was made. The dating of these footprints is what transformed White Sands from a fascinating regional curiosity into one of the most consequential sites in this entire investigation. Researchers used radiocarbon dating on seeds from an aquatic plant called Rupia serosa, found embedded directly within the same sediment layers as the footprints, seeds that would have grown and been deposited at essentially the same time the tracks were made. The results indicated an age range of approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years, later corroborated by additional dating methods, including analysis of quartz grains and pollen, in follow-up studies published in 2022 and 2023, each lending further support to the original timeline rather than undermining it. 23,000 years. Sit with that figure for a moment, alongside everything already traced through this investigation. This places confirmed, undisputed human presence in North America squarely within the last glacial maximum, the coldest, most inhospitable peak of the most recent ice age, a period when much of the continent lay locked beneath enormous ice sheets, and when the traditional Clovis-era migration model insisted no one had yet arrived at all. Unlike Furada, unlike Chiquihuite, unlike the Cerutti Mastodon site, the evidence at White Sands does not require interpreting a fractured bone or a possibly natural stone flake. These are footprints. Human footprints, unambiguous in origin, dated through multiple independent methods that have each, notably, converged on roughly the same figure. This is, by a wide margin, some of the most direct, hardest to dispute evidence yet found for a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas. And that directness has done something the other contested sites in this investigation have struggled to achieve. It has moved the scientific conversation. Where Pedra Furada's oldest claims remain, after decades, still generally regarded as a minority position, and Chiquihuite continues to face real skepticism over its stone assemblage, White Sands has been far more broadly, if not universally, accepted within the archaeological community. The nature of the evidence leaves comparatively little room for the geofact argument that has haunted so many other early-date claims. A footprint does not require an observer to imagine intention into an ambiguous fracture pattern. It is, quite simply, the direct physical record of a foot placed by a person at a specific moment in time. Still, acceptance of the dates has not resolved every question the site raises, and in some ways it has simply relocated the mystery rather than closed it. If humans were present in what is now New Mexico 23,000 years ago, walking freely enough across a lake shore to leave behind children's footprints alongside adult ones, seemingly play, running, pausing, then how and by what route did they arrive so early? The Bering land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska is generally understood to have been available for crossing during certain windows of this period, but the ice-free corridor that would have allowed early migrants to travel southward from Alaska into the rest of the continent is believed by most current models to have remained closed by glacial ice until considerably later, perhaps not opening until around 13,000 years ago. That leaves a genuine, still largely unresolved gap. How did people reach New Mexico if the most obvious inland route wasn't yet passable? The leading explanation offered by many researchers is a coastal migration route, following the Pacific shoreline by boat or on foot along exposed coastal margins, bypassing the ice sheets entirely by moving along the water's edge rather than through the continent's interior. This theory, sometimes called the Kelp Highway hypothesis, has gained increasing traction across multiple lines of pre-Clovis evidence, though direct archaeological confirmation remains difficult, largely because a coastal route from that era would now lie submerged beneath rising post-glacial sea levels, its evidence, if any survives, resting somewhere on a continental shelf we have barely begun to explore. What lingers longest about White Sands, though, is not the migration debate, significant as it is, but the strange, almost unbearable intimacy of the footprints themselves. These are not stone tools, standing at a cold remove from the individuals who made them. These are moments, specific and singular. A child's stride, an adult's pace slowing near a giant sloth. Someone's brief detour recorded in mud that dried and sealed and waited 23,000 years to be uncovered. Whoever they were, they did not know they were making history. They were only crossing a muddy shoreline on an ordinary day, in a world we are still working to understand, leaving behind, without any intention of doing so, the clearest message that ancient humanity has ever managed to send us. We were here. The dunes shift and reform above that lakebed constantly now, wind reshaping the surface every season, and archaeologists return again and again to see what the desert has uncovered or buried since their last visit. How many more footprints are still out there, waiting just beneath the white? A footprint is a message no one meant to send. What comes next in this investigation is the opposite. A message pressed deliberately into bone, in a place many people, even those following ancient human origins closely, may never have heard of. That same drive to leave something behind, intentional this time, reappears now on the other side of the world, in central China, in a site whose implications are still, even now, working their way through the field. The site is Lingjing, located in Xuchang County in China's Henan province, an area that has, since excavations began there in earnest in the early 2000s under archaeologist Li Zhanyang, produced one of the most important and still underappreciated hominin fossil assemblages in East Asia. Lingjing first drew significant international attention for skull fragments recovered from its sediment layers, remains that displayed a genuinely puzzling mix of anatomical features, some characteristics associated with Homo erectus, some resembling Neanderthals, and others that appeared more provocatively to overlap with traits typically associated with modern Homo sapiens. Dated to roughly 105,000 to 125,000 years old, these Xuchang skulls, as they came to be known, immediately complicated the relatively tidy family tree that most textbooks present for human evolution in Asia. suggesting a population that doesn't fit comfortably into any single established category, and that may represent a previously unrecognized or poorly understood lineage entirely. But the skulls, significant as they are not the focus of this chapter. Alongside the human remains, Li Zhenyang's team also recovered animal bones from the same layers, and among them, a small number bearing something that immediately drew comparison to some of the most contested sites already explored in this investigation. Deliberately incised, geometric engravings cut into the bone's surface with what researchers described as clear intention. Published analysis, including a 2020 study, identified a piece of bone marked with a series of parallel and crossing lines, forming a deliberate geometric pattern rather than the irregular scoring associated with butchery or trampling. Microscopic examination of the grooves suggested they were made using a stone tool, cutting with a consistent angle and pressure, in a sequence that appeared planned rather than incidental, echoing, in method if not in age, the same kind of engraved bone controversy already traced at Bilzingsleben in Germany, decades earlier and hundreds of thousands of years further back. What makes Lingjing distinct, and what has kept it circulating steadily through discussions of early symbolic behavior since its publication, is the combination of its age, its location, and its ambiguous makers. Roughly 105,000 to 125,000 years old, the engraved bone sits within a period and a region where the population responsible remains genuinely uncertain. Unlike Bruniquel or La Roche-Cotard, where the maker can be reasonably attributed to Neanderthals given the surrounding European context, and unlike Blombos, where Homo sapiens authorship is essentially undisputed, Lingjing occupies a murkier position. The skulls recovered from the same broad sedimentary context suggest a population that doesn't map cleanly onto any of the major recognized hominin groups active in Asia during this period, raising a real, still largely unanswered question. If this bone was engraved with symbolic intent, who exactly was capable of it, in a part of the world where the cast of characters remains so incompletely understood? Consider what an engraved pattern like this would mean, if the interpretation holds, layered onto everything else this investigation has already traced. Deliberate geometric markmaking, appearing independently, or at least without any confirmed connection, in Neolithic Scotland's carved spheres, in Blombos Cave's cross-hatched ochre, in the finger-dragged lines of La Roche-Cotard, and now here in central China, tens of thousands of years before, modern humans are confirmed to have been present in significant numbers in the region. Each of these sites, separated by enormous distances, and, in some cases, by hundreds of thousands of years, seems to point toward the same underlying capacity, an impulse toward pattern, toward marking surfaces with lines that serve no immediately practical purpose, appearing again and again across different hominin populations on different continents, largely independent of one another. Is that recurrence coincidence the simple repeated rediscovery of an easy, low-effort behavior that almost any sufficiently dexterous hand might eventually stumble into? Or does it suggest something closer to a shared, deep cognitive undercurrent, a capacity for abstraction that runs further back and further across the hominin family tree than the traditional story allows? Mainstream archaeological response to the Lingjing engravings has followed a now familiar pattern in this investigation: genuine interest, tempered by real caution. Researchers broadly agree that the marks appear deliberate rather than accidental, based on the consistency of the cutting angle and the clear geometric structure of the pattern, a conclusion that places the find within a small but growing body of evidence for pre-modern symbolic behavior across multiple regions and species. But the deeper question, what the engraving actually meant, and to whom, remains entirely outside the reach of the physical evidence, exactly as it has at every other engraved surface explored so far. and the added uncertainty over precisely which population created it, given the ambiguous, transitional nature of the Xuchang skulls found nearby, means Lingjing carries an extra layer of unresolved identity that even Bilzingsleben and La Roche-Cotard, contested as they remain, do not quite share. This uncertainty has, predictably, invited broader speculation beyond the immediate archaeological debate. Some researchers studying the Xuchang remains have proposed that this population may represent evidence of a previously unknown, or at least poorly documented, hominin lineage in East Asia, existing alongside and possibly interacting or interbreeding with Denisovans, whose genetic legacy is known, through DNA studies, to be particularly pronounced in East Asian and Oceanic populations today. If that possibility holds any weight, the engraved bone from Lingjing may represent not simply another data point in the broader story of ancient symbolic behavior, but a direct artifact of a population science has not yet fully identified, named, or placed with confidence anywhere on the human family tree. That is a genuinely unusual position for an archaeological find to occupy. Evidence of a behavior we can describe in some detail, produced by a maker we still cannot fully define. There is also a quieter, more structural mystery embedded in Lingjing's broader significance, one that echoes back through nearly every chapter of this investigation. For most of the 20th century, the major narratives of hominin evolution, migration, and behavioral complexity were built overwhelmingly around European and African evidence, in large part because those were the regions where sustained, well-funded excavation had occurred earliest and most extensively. Sites like Lingjing suggest that this narrative gap may reflect not the actual history of the species, but simply where, historically, we happen to be looking. How much of the human story, particularly across Asia, remains genuinely under-excavated, its sites unexplored, its bones and engraved fragments still sitting quietly in sediment that no research team has yet had the resources or the reason to disturb. The Xuchang skulls and their engraved companion bone remain under continued study in China, part of an active, ongoing area of research rather than a closed case awaiting only public awareness. New analysis methods, particularly in ancient DNA extraction, are gradually being applied to remains from this period and region, and it remains entirely possible that genetic evidence could someday clarify who these people actually were, resolving at least one layer of the mystery, even if the meaning of their engraved lines remains permanently out of reach. Until then, the bone sits in its case, its geometric pattern cut by a hand belonging to a population science still struggles to name. In a region, the standard story of human origins has only recently begun to take seriously. What else, we might ask, is waiting in the ground across a continent whose deep past we have barely started to read? And how much of what we call the human story has simply been the story of wherever we thought, so far, to dig? That engraved bone, cut by a hand belonging to a population still without a settled name, was found resting in sediment alongside something even harder to categorize: the skulls themselves. It's worth returning to them directly now, not as a supporting detail in someone else's mystery, but as the central mystery they actually are. The remains in question, recovered from that same site at Lingjing in Xuchang County, Henan Province, consist primarily of two partial skulls, excavated across a series of campaigns beginning in 2007 and continuing through 2014, under the direction of archaeologist Li Jianyang. The fragments were painstaking to recover and even more painstaking to reconstruct, pieced together over years from dozens of separate cranial fragments buried in the same lakeside sediment layers that would later yield the engraved bone. Dating of the surrounding sediment using a combination of methods including optically stimulated luminescence, placed the skulls at approximately 105,000 to 125,000 years old, a period in Asia's deep past for which the hominin fossil record remains frustratingly thin, with relatively few well-preserved specimens available for comparison against almost any new find. When researchers led by paleoanthropologist Xujie Wu finally completed detailed morphological analysis of the reconstructed skulls, publishing their findings in 2017 in the journal Science, what they described was not a clean match to any single, previously known hominin group. Instead, the Xuchang skulls presented what researchers termed a genuine mosaic, a combination of anatomical features that, individually, each pointed toward a different established lineage, but that together resisted easy classification into any one of them. Consider the specifics because they matter to why this mosaic is so difficult to explain away. The skulls displayed a relatively large cranial capacity, comparable to that of both Neanderthals and modern humans, suggesting brain volume well within the range associated with cognitively sophisticated hominins. Yet certain features of the brain case, including its low, elongated shape, aligned more closely with older, more archaic populations such as Homo erectus, a lineage that had, by most timelines, already diverged from the ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Then, layered on top of these seemingly contradictory signals, the inner ear structures of the Xuchang skulls, specifically the semicircular canals, a feature paleoanthropologists often rely on for lineage identification because it tends to be highly conserved and resistant to environmental influence, showed a pattern more typically associated with Neanderthals, a population whose confirmed range, at the time these individuals were alive, is generally understood to have been concentrated far to the west, across Europe and parts of Western Asia, not this deep into China's interior. 3 separate signals, then, each pointing toward a different, well-established group, coexisting within the same 2 skulls. How does a single population accumulate features that, according to the standard model of hominin divergence, shouldn't belong together in the first place? The explanations proposed by mainstream researchers cluster around a few general possibilities, each carrying its own significant implications. One interpretation holds that the Xuchang individuals represent a genuinely distinct, previously unrecognized hominin population, one that evolved somewhat independently in East Asia, retaining certain older erectus-like traits from a deep regional ancestry, while separately, convergently, developing some Neanderthal-like features through parallel evolutionary pressures rather than direct shared ancestry, a phenomenon not unheard of in evolutionary biology, but always a difficult case to prove conclusively without genetic evidence. Another, perhaps more provocative interpretation, suggests that the Neanderthal-like inner ear structure may instead point toward actual gene flow, evidence that populations related to Neanderthals had, at some point, made contact and interbred with an Eastern Asian hominin lineage far more extensively and far earlier than has been documented through the DNA record so far, essentially expanding the known geographic reach of Neanderthal genetic influence considerably further east than most current models comfortably allow. There's a third possibility as well, one that connects Xuchang more directly to a piece of the human family tree that remains, even now, one of the most mysterious of all: the Denisovans. Known almost entirely from the genetic evidence recovered at Denisova Cave, explored earlier in this investigation, Denisovans are understood, largely through DNA analysis, to have ranged widely across Asia and to have interbred with both Neanderthals and early modern humans in the region. Some researchers examining the Xuchang skulls have wondered aloud whether these individuals might represent Denisovans themselves, or a population closely related to them, a suggestion that, if eventually confirmed, would offer something Denisovan research has almost entirely lacked until now. an actual, reasonably complete cranium rather than the scattered finger bones, teeth, and jaw fragments that have, until this point, constituted nearly the entire physical record of who the Denisovans actually were. That last possibility is precisely why the Xuchang skulls have generated such sustained interest well beyond the specialist community that first studied them. If confirmed as Denisovan, or closely related to Denisovans, these skulls would represent an extraordinary opportunity, a face, or something close to one, finally attached to a population that has otherwise existed for scientists almost entirely as a genetic signature, detected in the DNA of living Asian and oceanic populations today, but never directly seen. Unfortunately, attempts to extract usable ancient DNA from the Xuchang remains have so far been unsuccessful, a common and deeply frustrating obstacle in this kind of research, since DNA degrades steadily over time and survives only under unusually favorable preservation conditions. Conditions the warm, humid climate of central China does not typically provide as reliably as the colder environments where Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA has been more successfully recovered. Without genetic confirmation, the Denisovan hypothesis remains an intriguing possibility rather than an established fact, and researchers studying the skulls have generally been careful to present it as one plausible interpretation among several, rather than a settled conclusion. What ties the Xuchang skulls back to everything else traced in this investigation is not simply their age, or even the tantalizing possibility of a Denisovan connection, but the broader pattern they represent. Time and again, from Bilzingsleben to Lingjing itself, from the notched wood at Kalambo Falls to the ambiguous inner ear structures found here in Henan Province, the deeper the excavation goes, the less the human family tree resembles the clean, branching diagram most of us grew up seeing in textbooks. Instead, a more tangled picture keeps emerging, populations overlapping in time and geography far more than expected, features blending across supposedly separate lineages, boundaries between species growing softer the more closely they're examined. The Xuchang skulls sit near the center of that blur, a mosaic that resists the easy, single-label answer paleoanthropology has traditionally preferred to give. Li Jianyang's excavation at Lingjing continues, and researchers studying the Xuchang remains have indicated that further analysis, along with the ongoing hope that new extraction techniques might someday recover usable genetic material, could eventually resolve at least part of this mystery. Until then, the skulls remain exactly what they have been since 2017. A set of features that refuse to sort neatly into any of the categories we've built to make sense of our own ancient family. Were these individuals the descendants of a hidden, independent branch of humanity, evolving quietly in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years? Were they the living evidence of contact between populations we've long assumed never met? Or were they perhaps the closest look anyone has ever gotten at the Denisovans themselves, staring back at us from a reconstruction built patiently from fragments, waiting for the rest of their story to be recovered from whatever ground or whatever bone still holds it? From the ambiguous skulls of Henan Province, we return once more to southern Africa, to a mountain range straddling the border of South Africa and Eswatini, from which this next site takes its name. The Lebombo Mountains rise steeply along that border, and tucked into their slopes sits Border Cave, a modest limestone shelter that has, since excavations began there in the 1930s, and continued in more rigorous, systematic form through the following decades, quietly become one of the most important sites for understanding the deep roots of modern human behavior in Africa. Border Cave's occupation layers span an extraordinary length of time, with evidence of human presence stretching back over 200,000 years, making it one of the longest continuously documented archaeological sequences on the continent. Within these layers, researchers have recovered a remarkably well-preserved collection of organic artifacts, a rarity in most archaeological contexts, made possible here by the cave's consistently dry conditions, which have allowed wood, plant fiber, and other perishable materials to survive in a way they almost never do elsewhere. Among these fragile survivors is the object at the center of this chapter, a small, carefully worked wooden applicator stick, recovered from a layer dated to approximately 24,000 years old. Its tip coated in a dark, hardened residue that would, upon closer chemical analysis, tell a story far more unsettling than its unassuming appearance first suggested. That analysis, published by a research team led by Lynn Wadley, the same archaeologist whose work on compound adhesives at Sibudu Cave was explored earlier in this investigation, identified the residue on the applicator's tip as containing ricinoleic acid, a compound derived from the castor bean plant, and one that, notably, is toxic. The specific chemical signature combined with the object's shape, a slender stick worked to a fine, deliberate point, closely designed for precise, controlled application, led researchers to a striking conclusion. This was very likely a poison applicator, an implement used to coat the tips of arrows, or possibly other weapons with a toxic compound intended to increase their lethality against prey, or potentially against other humans. Consider what this object implies, layered against a 24,000-year-old date. The deliberate use of poison in hunting or conflict requires a body of specialized botanical knowledge that goes well beyond simply recognizing which plants are edible and which are dangerous. It requires understanding which specific plant produces a compound potent enough to disable or kill when introduced into the bloodstream through even a minor wound. Knowledge of how to extract or prepare that compound in usable form, and an understanding, crucially, of how to apply it without harming oneself in the process, since many of the same toxins effective against prey remain equally dangerous to the person handling them. This is not casual, incidental knowledge. It is the kind of specialized expertise that suggests sustained experimentation, observation, and, once again, that now familiar requirement running through so much of this investigation: reliable transmission from person to person, generation to generation, refined and preserved as a body of practical toxicology passed down entirely through direct instruction and memory. The border cave applicator is not, notably, the only evidence for early poison use recovered from African archaeological contexts, though it remains among the oldest and most chemically well documented. Other researchers studying hunter-gatherer traditions still practiced in parts of southern Africa today have noted that some contemporary groups, including certain San communities, continue to use poisoned arrows in hunting, employing toxins derived from beetle larvae, plant extracts, and snake venom, a living tradition that offers a rare, direct point of comparison for interpreting ancient evidence like the border cave find. This continuity is part of what makes the interpretation of the applicator stick relatively well supported within mainstream archaeology, more so, notably, than many of the more contested finds explored earlier in this investigation. Unlike an ambiguous engraved line or a possibly natural stone fracture, a chemical residue can be directly analyzed and matched against known toxic compounds, offering a degree of certainty that ambiguous physical marks simply cannot provide. And yet, even with this relative chemical certainty, Border Cave still opens onto questions this investigation has learned, by now, to expect. What was this poison actually used for, in that specific moment 24,000 years ago? Hunting remains the most straightforward, most widely accepted explanation, and it fits comfortably within what is known about the diet and subsistence strategies of the population living at Border Cave during this period. But some researchers have raised the possibility, more cautiously, that poisoned weapons may also have played a role in interpersonal conflict between human groups, a use that, if confirmed at sites this old, would push back the documented history of chemical weaponry, in the loosest sense of that term, considerably further than most accounts of early human violence typically allow. There is no direct evidence at Border Cave confirming this darker application specifically. No wound pattern or skeletal trauma clearly tied to the applicator itself, and most researchers remain appropriately cautious about extending the interpretation beyond what the residue can actually support. But the possibility, once raised, is difficult to fully set aside, if only because it fits within a broader, well-documented pattern across human history of technologies developed for one purpose, eventually finding their way toward another. There is also the deeper, quieter question of scale, one that echoes the same uncertainty raised earlier around the compound adhesive found at Sibudu Cave. A single applicator stick, however well preserved, represents one moment, one individual's use of a technology that must have existed within a much wider, largely invisible tradition of botanical knowledge, most of which left no trace at all. Plant-based poisons, unlike stone tools or carved bone, degrade rapidly under most conditions, surviving into the archaeological record only under precisely the kind of rare, arid preservation conditions found at Border Cave. This raises an uncomfortable, unresolvable question. How much earlier and how much more widespread might this kind of specialized toxicological knowledge have actually been, hidden entirely from the archaeological record simply because the organic evidence needed to prove it almost never survives long enough to be found? Some researchers, working from the same gap in the evidence, have proposed that sophisticated plant knowledge, including the deliberate use of toxins, may represent one of the oldest and most consistently underestimated categories of human technology, a body of expertise that, unlike stone tools, leaves behind almost nothing for archaeology to recover, except in the rarest of circumstances. If that's true, the true depth of humanity's relationship with the toxic and medicinal properties of the plant world may be substantially older and substantially more widespread than the small handful of sites like Border Cave can ever fully demonstrate on their own, each discovery representing not a beginning, but simply the first fragment lucky enough to survive. The applicator stick itself remains carefully preserved today, its residue analyzed down to the molecular level, its shape and purpose about as well understood as any artifact examined so far in this investigation. And still, standing in front of it, the questions multiply rather than resolve. Who first discovered that this particular plant, prepared in this particular way, could turn a simple wooden point into something capable of killing at a distance? How many failed experiments, how many miscalculations came before that knowledge was refined into something safe enough to teach and reliable enough to pass down across 24,000 years and counting? And if this fragile stick survived only by the rare chance of a dry cave floor, how much of that same ancient, dangerous expertise has already been lost completely, dissolved quietly into soil that never happened to keep it secret? 24,000 years is a long time to wait for an answer. But travel back further still, past Border Cave's poisoned point, past the mosaic skulls of Xuchang, back through nearly 50,000 years of additional silence, and we arrive at a single, narrow window in the Rhône Valley of southern France. A window so brief that archaeologists now believe it may represent one specific season, one particular year, in which two different kinds of humans crossed paths at the mouth of the same cave. The site is Grotte Mandrin, a rock shelter overlooking the Rhône River near the town of Malataverne. excavated over more than 3 decades by a team led by archaeologist Ludovic Slimak. What sets Mandrin apart from nearly every other site explored in this investigation is not a single artifact or a single controversial date, but the extraordinary resolution of its sediment record, layer stacked upon layer with unusually fine, well-preserved stratigraphy, allowing researchers to reconstruct occupation patterns at Mandrin with a level of chronological precision rarely available at sites this old. And what that precision revealed, in a landmark study published in 2022 in the journal Science Advances, was something genuinely unexpected. Definitive evidence that modern Homo sapiens had reached this part of Europe roughly 54,000 years ago, considerably earlier than the long-accepted timeline for their arrival on the continent, and that these modern humans appear to have occupied the cave for a distinct, relatively short period, before the site's more familiar occupants, Neanderthals, returned to it afterward. The evidence establishing modern human presence centers on a single, remarkably well-preserved child's tooth, recovered from a specific layer within the site's sequence, alongside a distinctive assemblage of stone tools associated with that same layer, technology that Slimak's team identified as belonging to a tradition markedly different from the Mysterian toolkit typically associated with Neanderthal populations throughout this region. The tooth itself underwent careful analysis, including structural comparison of its internal dental morphology, ultimately identifying it as belonging to Homo sapiens rather than a Neanderthal individual. Combined with precise dating of the surrounding sediment, the evidence placed modern humans at Mandrin roughly 54,000 years ago, pushing back the previously accepted timeline for Homo sapiens' arrival in this part of Europe by several thousand years. That alone would have been a significant finding on its own. But the layers immediately above and below this modern human occupation told an even stranger story. Directly beneath the Homo sapiens layer, and directly above it in later sediment, researchers found clear evidence of Neanderthal occupation instead, the familiar Mousterian tools, without any modern human presence. This layered sequence, Neanderthal, then modern human, then Neanderthal again, suggested something that had rarely, if ever, been documented with this degree of stratigraphic clarity. Not a single, decisive replacement of one population by another, but an alternating pattern, Neanderthals and modern humans occupying the exact same shelter at different points, potentially separated by a surprisingly narrow window of time. Before Neanderthals returned to the site, modern humans had briefly, temporarily, called their own. Consider what this pattern implies about the broader and long-debated question of how Neanderthals and modern humans actually interacted as their ranges began to overlap across Europe. For decades, the dominant narrative treated this transition as a relatively swift, one-directional process. Modern humans arrived, expanded, and Neanderthals, whether through competition, disease, climate pressure, or some combination of factors, gradually disappeared from the landscape within a few thousand years. Mandrin complicates that picture considerably. If modern humans were present in this specific location as early as 54,000 years ago, only to apparently withdraw or vanish from the site, allowing Neanderthals to reoccupy it afterward, then the boundary between these two populations in this particular corner of Europe may have shifted back and forth repeatedly over an extended period, rather than moving in one clean, forward direction. This raises an obvious and difficult question. What happened to the modern humans who briefly occupied Mandrin 54,000 years ago? Did they move on to other, better documented sites elsewhere in Europe, part of a broader wave of early modern human dispersal that simply left fainter traces at Mandrin itself? Did local conditions, climate shifts, resource scarcity, or something else entirely push them back out of the region, clearing the way for Neanderthals to reclaim territory they had only briefly lost? Or does Mandrin represent something more unusual still? A genuinely failed, isolated attempt at expansion. One small group of modern humans reaching this specific valley, establishing a foothold for a season or two, and then, for reasons the sediment cannot fully explain, disappearing from the archaeological record entirely, their presence in Europe not becoming permanently established here until thousands of years later. Slimak and his colleagues have approached these questions with considerable caution, noting that Mandrin represents a single site, however precisely dated, and that broader conclusions about population movement across the continent require corroboration from additional locations before the full picture can be considered settled. Still, the implications have rippled outward through the wider field, prompting renewed interest in re-examining other European sites with fresh eyes, searching for similarly fine-grained evidence that might reveal comparable patterns of overlap, retreat, and return elsewhere, along the frontier between these two populations. There is a genuinely haunting quality to what Mandrin suggests once you sit with it. For most of the 20th century, the story of Neanderthals and modern humans in Europe was told as a story with a clear direction. One population steadily displacing another until only one remained. Mandrin suggests something closer to a slow, uncertain negotiation played out across an unknown number of generations. Two different kinds of humans repeatedly testing the same territory, each leaving and returning, neither holding it permanently, for long enough that we are only now, through extraordinarily careful excavation, beginning to glimpse the exchange at all. Did the modern humans who briefly sheltered at Mandrin ever encounter the Neanderthals who came before or after them? Even indirectly, through tools left behind, through fires still faintly warm, through signs of another kind of hand having recently occupied the same stone floor. We cannot know. The child whose tooth survived long enough to answer one question left behind nothing that could answer the others. What Grotte Mandrin ultimately offers is not a resolution to the broader mystery of how modern humans and Neanderthals related to one another as their worlds overlapped, but a far more precise, far more intimate window into just how complicated, how back and forth, how genuinely uncertain that relationship may have been on the ground, in any single valley, at any single moment. The Rhone still runs past the cave mouth today, indifferent to whichever population once watched it from that same rocky overhang. How many other shelters across Europe, still unexcavated or insufficiently examined, might hold a similarly layered secret, waiting for the right kind of patient, careful digging to finally reveal it. Leave behind the wind-scoured coastlines and the silence of stone circles for a moment. Travel now to the heart of North America, to central Texas, where a small creek called Buttermilk winds through post-oak savanna, and where beneath a modest farm field, one of the most contested chapters in the story of the Americas lies buried in clay. This is the Gauss site. To look at it today, you would see little more than a shallow valley, a spring-fed creek, and the kind of quiet, unremarkable landscape easy to drive past without a second glance. But archaeologists have spent decades excavating this ground, layer by careful layer, and what they have found here has forced a reconsideration of one of the oldest and most stubborn narratives in American prehistory, the story of who arrived first and when. For much of the 20th century, that story seemed settled. The Clovis culture, named for the fluted stone spear points first identified near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s, was widely accepted as the founding population of the Americas. Mammoth hunters who crossed a land bridge from Siberia around 13,000 years ago, spreading southward with remarkable speed, leaving behind their distinctive, elegantly fluted points as a kind of signature. It was a clean story, a single point of origin, a single technology, a single migration. The Gault site does not fit cleanly into that story. Beneath the layer where Clovis points were found, precisely where they were expected to be, excavators kept digging. And the digging did not stop at sterile soil. It continued into older sediment that, by every method of dating available, predates Clovis by more than 2,000 years. And in that older layer, they found something that should not have been there, according to the accepted timeline. Stone tools. Thousands of them. Deliberately shaped, carefully worked, unmistakably the product of human hands. What makes this discovery so difficult to dismiss is not merely its age, but its character. The tools recovered from what researchers now call the Gault assemblage are not crude, opportunistic flakes, the kind of expedient technology one might expect from a population still finding its footing in a new land. They show planning. They show a developed, internally consistent method of production. Thin, lanceolate blades, bifacial tools worked with control and intention. A technological tradition that appears, in the archaeological record, already competent, as though it had a history of its own, one that unfolded somewhere else before it ever reached this creek bed in Texas. And this is where the questions begin to multiply. If these tools predate Clovis, and if their makers were not simply proto-Clovis people fumbling toward the fluted point tradition, then who were they? Where did their technology come from? And most unsettling of all, if people were already living, hunting, and crafting sophisticated stone tools in central Texas more than 15,000 years ago, how did they get there, at a time when the traditional ice-free corridor through the North American interior is believed to have still been sealed by glacial ice? The land bridge theory has an elegant simplicity. It assumes a single route, a single wave, a single moment when the way south opened. But Gault is not alone in complicating that picture. Sites across the Americas, from Chile to Pennsylvania to Idaho, have yielded dates that push human presence back before the corridor could have been passable. Taken individually, any one of these sites might be dismissed as an anomaly, a dating error, a disturbed layer. Taken together, they form a pattern that is increasingly difficult to explain away. So, archaeologists have begun asking a different question. Not simply when did people arrive, but how. One hypothesis, once considered fringe and now treated with growing seriousness, proposes a coastal migration, that early populations did not walk down the center of the continent at all, but moved along the Pacific shoreline, following kelp forests and marine resources south by boat, bypassing the ice sheets entirely. It is an elegant solution to the timing problem. It is also, frustratingly, almost impossible to test directly. Sea levels have risen more than 100 meters since the end of the last glacial period. Whatever coastal camps or vessels these earliest travelers might have left behind now lie underwater, buried beneath the continental shelf, likely beyond recovery. Which means that for a discovery like Gault, we may be looking not at a beginning, but at a middle chapter, evidence of a story whose opening pages are submerged, literally, beneath the sea. There is something worth sitting with here. The tools found in the older layer at Gault do not closely resemble Clovis technology. They are not primitive Clovis. They are something else, a distinct approach to shaping stone executed with confidence. This raises the possibility, still debated and far from resolved, that Clovis technology did not spread outward from a single point of origin in the way it was long assumed to. It may have developed in place, in North America itself, from an older technological tradition already present on the continent. A tradition Gault may be our clearest window into. Consider what that would mean. Not one migration, but perhaps several, arriving by different routes at different times, carrying different toolkits, encountering a land already occupied, or at least already visited, by people whose names, languages, and even physical appearance remain entirely unknown to us. We have their tools. We do not have their faces, their voices, or their stories. Skeptics urge caution, and they are right to. Dating a site of this age is an exercise in extraordinary difficulty. Sediments shift. Layers can be disturbed by burrowing animals, by flooding, by the slow creep of soil over thousands of years. Establishing that an artifact and its surrounding sediment share the same age requires meticulous, often painstaking verification. The researchers at Gaul have applied multiple independent dating techniques, optically stimulated luminescence among them, precisely because a single method, however careful, could not settle a claim this consequential on its own. And even now, with corroborating results, some in the field remain unconvinced, waiting for further confirmation, for additional sites, for a broader consensus to form around a picture that is still, in many ways, being drawn in pencil rather than ink. That caution is not obstruction. It is how the discipline protects itself from being led astray by a single anomalous result. But caution, applied honestly, cuts in both directions. And it is worth noting that the number of pre-Clovis sites showing similar patterns has only grown in recent decades, not shrunk. The weight of evidence has shifted, even if the final picture has not yet come into focus. Stand at Grotte today, at the edge of that quiet Texas creek, and it is difficult not to feel the strangeness of it. The way ordinary ground can conceal an argument that reaches back more than 15,000 years, unsettling assumptions that once seemed as solid as the stone tools themselves. Somewhere beneath your feet, hands shaped these blades with a skill that took generations to develop. Whoever they were, they did not appear here fully formed. They came from somewhere. They carried a tradition already old. We know their tools. We do not know their names, their journey, or how many others like them once moved through this land, leaving no trace we have yet found, or none that has survived the passage of so much time. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson the Grotte site offers, more than any single artifact, that the story of the first Americans may not be a single thread at all, but a tangle of arrivals, routes, and peoples we are only beginning to glimpse, each one waiting, still, beneath the soil, for the layer above it to be carefully lifted away. A question was left hanging over that Texas creek bed. If the ice-free corridor was still sealed, how did people move south? That question does not stay buried in Texas. It resurfaces nearly 2,000 miles to the northwest, along the banks of a river in what is now western Idaho, where the answer may be written into the ground itself. The Salmon River carves through a steep, forested canyon here, its water cold and fast even in summer, its banks lined with basalt and pine. This place is known today as Cooper's Ferry, a modest bend in the river, unassuming to the casual eye, chosen by ancient people, it seems, for the same reasons anyone might choose it. Shelter from the wind, easy access to water, a vantage point over the valley below, and salmon running upriver in numbers that would have made this spot a reliable place to return to, season after season, for generations. For more than a decade, archaeologists have excavated this terrace above the river, and what they have uncovered here has become one of the most quietly significant discoveries in the study of the earliest Americans. Beneath layers of sediment, beneath the accumulated silt of thousands of years, they found a hearth. Charcoal, fragments of bone, some of it burned, some of it worked, and stone tools, not crude, not accidental, but deliberately shaped, the products of a technology carried by people who already knew what they were doing. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest of these materials at more than 15,000 years old. Some estimates push closer to 16,000. To put that in perspective, this is earlier than Clovis, earlier, in fact, than the opening of the ice-free corridors believed to have occurred. If the dates are correct, and they have been tested, retested, and defended through peer review with the rigor born of knowing how much skepticism such a claim would invite, then the people who built this hearth arrived in the interior of North America before the traditional inland route existed at all. Which returns us to the question that would not stay buried. How? The tools recovered at Cooper's Ferry offer a curious, almost startling clue. Some of the stone points found here bear a resemblance, not identical, but structurally similar, to artifacts recovered from sites in northern Japan, dated to a period more than 16,000 years ago. It is a comparison archaeologists make carefully, aware of how easily such parallels can be overstated. Similar shapes can emerge independently, born of similar problems needing similar solutions, without any direct connection between the people who made them. And yet, the resemblance is close enough and specific enough that it cannot simply be waved away. It sits there, unresolved, in the artifact trays. If there is a connection, and this remains a genuine if, argued over in journals and conference halls rather than settled, it would lend support to the coastal migration hypothesis raised in our last chapter, that early populations moved not through the center of the continent, but along its western edge, following the Pacific shoreline south by boat, harvesting kelp forests, fish, and shellfish as they went, bypassing the ice sheets entirely. Cooper's Ferry sits inland today, but it does not sit far from the Columbia and Snake River systems, waterways that thread from the interior all the way to the coast. A group moving south along the shoreline could have turned inland here, following the salmon runs upriver, and found this bend in the canyon as good a place as any to stop. It is a compelling picture. It is also, like so much of this period, built on fragments. The land bridge those hypothetical seafarers might have followed is now, in most places, underwater, swallowed by the same rising seas that erased the coastal camps we discussed in the previous chapter. What survives at Cooper's Ferry, sitting well above the modern floodplain, may be one of the only inland echoes we have of a coastal journey we can no longer trace at its source. There is something else here worth sitting with. The hearth found at Cooper's Ferry was not an isolated event, a single fire built once and abandoned. The site shows signs of repeated use, layer over layer, as though this place mattered to the people who found it, a known point on a route, perhaps, or a seasonal camp returned to year after year. What draws a group of people back to the same bend in a river, generation after generation, across a span of time we can barely picture? Was it simply the salmon, arriving reliably each year as they still do today? Or was there something more, a place remembered, passed down, spoken of before it was ever seen? We cannot know. The people themselves left no names, no language we can recover, nothing but the objects their hands shaped and the ash of fires long since gone cold. And yet the placement of this site, tucked into a canyon bend with a clear view up and down the river, suggests people who understood this landscape intimately, who were not simply passing through unfamiliar territory for the first time, but moving with purpose, perhaps along a route already known to those who came before them. This is where mainstream caution meets more speculative terrain, and where the line between the two is worth drawing carefully. Some researchers have suggested that sites like Cooper's Ferry, taken together with the stone tool traditions found at Gaul and elsewhere, may represent not one migration, but several distinct waves, arriving by different routes and at different times, each contributing separate threads to what would eventually become the vast diversity of indigenous peoples across the Americas. Others urge more restraint, noting that a handful of sites, however striking, cannot yet support a fully revised model of continental settlement, that more evidence, more dates, more independently verified sites are needed before the old story is fully set aside for a new one. Both positions are, in their own way, doing exactly what careful inquiry should do. One end of the pendulum guards against getting swept up in a single new discovery, however remarkable. The other reminds us that the archaeological record has already been wrong once about how confidently we could claim to know the beginning of this story. Cooper's Ferry does not resolve the tension between them. It sharpens it. Consider the layers of sediment that had to accumulate, undisturbed above that hearth for over 15,000 years, protecting the ash and bone and stone from the forces that erase almost everything given enough time. Flooding, freezing, the slow grinding work of the river itself. What allowed this fragile record to survive here, in this exact bend of the canyon, when so much else from this period has simply vanished? Was it chance alone, the accident of geography and geology? Or were there other camps like it, other hearths built along this same river system, still waiting under sediment that has not yet been disturbed by a trowel? Stand on that terrace above the Salmon River today, and look down at the water moving fast and cold below. Somewhere beneath that current and beneath the silt that lines this canyon, there may be more chapters of this story than we have yet found. Camps built and abandoned, tools dropped and buried, fires lit and left to go cold, each one a small, stubborn piece of evidence in an argument that is still, after all these years, far from settled. The people of Cooper's Ferry came from somewhere. They arrived by some route we can only partially reconstruct, carrying knowledge and technology already refined before they ever reached this river. And they left behind just enough, a hearth, a handful of stones, a scatter of bone, to tell us they were here first, long before anyone thought to look for them. What we do not know, and may never know with certainty, is how many others walked or paddled or waded along that same vanished coastline before them, and how much of that story still lies beneath the water or beneath the ground, waiting for the next layer to be lifted away. 10,000 years before the first fires were ever lit on that Idaho riverbank, and half a world away, a different kind of encounter was unfolding, one that would leave behind not a hearth, but a skull. In the western Galilee of northern Israel, in a limestone cave carved deep into a hillside above the Manat stream, cavers rappelling through a collapsed sinkhole in 2008 found themselves in a chamber untouched by human presence for tens of thousands of years. Stalactites hung from the ceiling in formations that had grown, drop by mineral-laden drop, across an almost unfathomable span of time. The air was still, and on a rocky ledge deep within the cave, partially coated in the same calcite that had sealed the chamber shut, lay a piece of bone unlike anything found in the region before. The upper portion of a human skull, a calvaria, its dome smooth, and its contours unmistakably deliberate to the trained eye that first uncovered it. What followed was years of careful, painstaking analysis, because a single skull, isolated from its context, can tell you very little. It was the dating, the shape, and the location together that would make Manat Cave one of the most quietly extraordinary discoveries in the story of human origins. The calcite crust that had formed over the bone became, in a sense, the key to unlocking its age. Using uranium-thorium dating on that mineral coating, a technique that measures the slow, steady decay of radioactive elements trapped within the rock, researchers determined the skull to be approximately 55,000 years old. This figure matters enormously, because 55,000 years ago sits squarely within one of the most debated windows in all of human prehistory. The period when Homo sapiens, having already begun moving out of Africa, were making their way through the Levant, the narrow corridor of land connecting Africa to Eurasia, at almost exactly the same time that Neanderthal still occupied much of the same region. This was not, in other words, a skull from a moment when modern humans had the landscape to themselves. It was a skull from the overlap. From the narrow, uncertain window when two different kinds of humans may have shared the same hills, drunk from the same streams, and quite possibly in ways we are still working to understand, encountered one another directly. And here is where the shape of the skull itself becomes the center of the mystery. Anatomically, the Manat calvaria is modern. Its rounded brain case, its structure, align it clearly with Homo sapiens rather than Neanderthals. This much the researchers who studied it agree on. But modern is a broad category, and the skull carries certain features that have made paleoanthropologists pause. A slight ridging, subtle characteristics in the bone that some researchers have described as possible signs of admixture, traces, however faint, of a population that was not purely and exclusively modern human in ancestry. Is this evidence of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, captured in bone, from precisely the era and precisely the region where genetic studies have told us that interbreeding was happening? Or is it simply the natural variation one would expect to find in any population of early modern humans, adapting and diversifying as they spread into new environments? The skull does not answer this question for us. It only raises it, and raises it at exactly the moment in human history when the question matters most. Consider what we already know, from a source entirely separate from any fossil, our own DNA. Genetic studies of modern human populations have established, with a confidence that would have seemed impossible only 2 decades ago, that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Most people of non-African descent today carry measurable percentages of Neanderthal DNA, a genetic inheritance passed down from encounters that occurred somewhere in this same general period, in this same general region, as modern humans expanded out of Africa and into territory Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years before them. We have the genetic proof that this happened. What we have almost never had is a physical, skeletal witness to the population in which it happened, a face, or, in this case, a partial skull, from the actual time and place where these two lineages of humanity crossed paths. Manat Cave, sitting in the Levantine corridor, dated to precisely this window, may be the closest thing to that witness we currently possess. And yet a single skull cannot carry the full weight of that story alone. Science, done carefully, resists the temptation to make one fossil answer a question this large. The researchers who published their findings on the Manat skull were measured in their language, describing it as consistent with and suggestive of, rather than proof of interbreeding at this specific location. The distinction matters. A single specimen can support a hypothesis. It cannot by itself confirm one. But consider too what surrounds the skull, because Manat Cave did not offer up this single artifact in isolation. The cave itself shows evidence of long, repeated human occupation, layer after layer of habitation stretching across tens of thousands of years, encompassing tool traditions associated with both Neanderthal and early modern human populations. Later layers within the same cave system contain artifacts linked to the Aurignacian culture, one of the earliest and most distinctive modern human toolmaking traditions in Europe and the Near East. Objects that include not just tools, but engraved fragments and ochre, hints of symbolic behavior, of meaning-making, layered into the sediment above where the skull was found. This raises a further, quieter question. If modern humans were living in this cave, using it across such a vast stretch of time, and if Neanderthals occupied caves not far from this very valley during overlapping centuries, how much contact was there really? Occasional and wary, a shared landscape more avoided than embraced, or closer, more sustained, more woven into daily life than we have generally imagined. Trade, proximity, perhaps even kinship, in the fullest sense of that word? The cave offers no simple answer. It offers instead the outline of a world we are only beginning to reconstruct, a world where the boundary between one kind of human and another may have been far less rigid, far less absolute than the tidy categories we now use to describe them. There is something almost vertiginous in standing at the mouth of that sinkhole above the Manat stream, knowing what lies beneath. A skull that waited in the dark for 55,000 years, sealed beneath slowly accumulating stone, untouched by light or air, while above it entire civilizations rose and fell. Entire species vanished. Entire chapters of the human story played out and were forgotten. It surfaced only because a handful of cavers happened to find their way into a chamber that chance and geology had otherwise kept closed. How many other chambers like it remain sealed somewhere in these hills, holding their own fragments of that same uncertain overlap? How many faces from that narrow, extraordinary window in our history are still waiting, coated in calcite, for the ground above them to finally give way? The Manat skull does not tell us definitively that two kinds of humanity met and mingled in this valley. It tells us only that the possibility is written into the very landscape where it was found, into the timing, the geography, the ambiguous curve of a single bone. Whether that possibility will ever harden into certainty may depend entirely on what else remains hidden beneath these hills, waiting for someone to notice a way in. Leave the hills above the Manat stream behind and travel south now, down through the length of the African continent, to a place where the land meets the sea in dramatic fashion. Here, on the southern coast of South Africa, limestone cliffs rise sharply above the Indian Ocean, and at their base, cut into the rock by millennia of wind and water, sits a series of caves known collectively as Klaasi's River. The sea here is relentless. Waves break against the cliff face with a steady, ancient rhythm, and the caves themselves feel less like shelters than like wounds in the rock, hollowed out over a span of time that stretches back long before anything resembling a modern human mind existed to witness it. And yet it was here, in these caves, that something resembling a modern human mind first began to leave its mark. Excavations at Klaasi's River, ongoing since the 1960s, have revealed a sequence of occupation layers stretching back more than 120,000 years, placing this site not at the edge of the human story, but very near one of its beginnings. This is Middle Stone Age Africa, long before agriculture, long before cities, long before writing, in an era when Homo sapiens was still a young species, physically much like us, but only beginning to develop the behaviors we now think of as distinctly, unmistakably human. Among the most significant finds within these layers are the hearths. Not a single fire, not an isolated event, but complexes of hearths returned to again and again across thousands of years, layer stacked upon layer, evidence of controlled fire used deliberately, repeatedly, and with apparent purpose. Ash lenses, charcoal, burned bone, some of it showing clear signs of having been cooked rather than simply caught in an accidental blaze. This was fire as technology, understood, managed, and passed down. That alone would be significant. But it is what surrounds these hearths that has drawn the closer, more careful attention of researchers in recent decades. Because the people who built these fires were not simply cooking. The layers at Klaasi's River contain some of the earliest known evidence of shellfish harvesting anywhere in the world. Deliberate, systematic exploitation of the coastline for food, timed, it appears, to the rhythms of the tides. They contain worked ochre, a mineral pigment with no nutritional or practical use, gathered and processed for reasons that can only be described as symbolic. And they contain stone tool technology showing a level of refinement. Small, carefully worked blades among them, that some researchers argue anticipates innovations not otherwise seen in the archaeological record for tens of thousands of years afterward. Here is where the mystery begins to take shape. If the people of Clayses River were already harvesting the sea with this kind of precision, already using fire in complex and repeated ways, already gathering and processing pigment for reasons that appeared to reach beyond mere survival, at a point so early in the human story, what does that suggest about how quickly the modern human mind came into being? Was this the slow, gradual dawning of behavioral complexity that the traditional model describes, one small innovation compounding on another across hundreds of generations? Or does it suggest something more abrupt, a threshold crossed earlier and more suddenly than we have generally assumed? The ochre is where this question sharpens most. Ochre use is often treated by researchers as a proxy for symbolic thought. The idea being that a mineral pigment, gathered specifically for its color and processed with care, implies some form of meaning-making beyond the practical demands of finding food and shelter. Body decoration, perhaps? Social signaling. The marking of status, of belonging, of identity. We cannot know precisely what the ochre at Clayses River meant to the people who used it, that meaning, whatever it was, died with them, leaving only the pigment itself as evidence that meaning existed at all. But its presence, this early, in these quantities across these many layers, tells us that something was already happening in the human mind, more than 100,000 years ago, that we tend to associate with a much later, more recent chapter of our story. And then there is the question the Hearths themselves seem to ask wordlessly, layer after layer. Why here? Why did people return to this exact stretch of coastline, generation after generation, for tens of thousands of years, when so much of the surrounding landscape offered other options? Was it simply the reliability of the resource, the shellfish beds replenished by every tide, a food source that required skill to harvest but rewarded that skill predictably? Or was there something else at work, something closer to memory, to a place known and passed down, spoken of by parents to children long before any of it could have been written down? Mainstream archaeology offers a careful, well-supported explanation for what Clayses River represents. A window into the early behavioral flexibility of Homo sapiens in southern Africa. A population experimenting with coastal resources, fire, and symbolic material culture during a formative period, laying behavioral groundwork that would, over tens of thousands of years, spread and intensify as modern humans expanded across the continent and eventually out of it entirely. This explanation fits the evidence. It does not require anything exotic or unexplained. And for most of what has been found at Clayses River, it remains the most defensible account we have. But there are researchers, working at the edges of this consensus, who point to the sheer density and sophistication of what has been found here, and ask whether our timeline for the emergence of modern human behavior needs to be pushed earlier still. Whether what we are calling the gradual dawn of symbolic thought was, in places like this, less a dawn than a series of scattered fires, kindled early in pockets, long before the broader spread of these behaviors becomes visible elsewhere in the archaeological record. It is a minority position, and it remains unproven. But the Hearths at Clayses River, cold now for over 100,000 years, do not entirely settle the argument either way. Stand at the mouth of one of these caves today and look out at the same stretch of ocean that fed the people who once gathered here. The tide moves in and out with the same rhythm it always has, indifferent to the tens of thousands of years that separate you from the hands that once shaped stone and gathered pigment on this shore. The rock has recorded their presence in ash and bone and ochre, but it has not recorded their thoughts, their language, their understanding of what they were doing when they knelt at these fires and processed that mineral into something more than mere color. We are left, in the end, with fragments, a hearth, a shell midden, a smear of ochre pressed into ancient sediment, and the unavoidable question of what they add up to. Were the people of Claycy's River simply surviving with unusual skill, or were they already, in some early and fragile way, becoming something more? The cliffs keep their silence. The waves continue their rhythm, exactly as they did when those fires were lit, and somewhere in these layered caves there may yet be evidence that pushes the question further back still, waiting for the next excavation to bring it into the light.